Somewhere in the North Atlantic, in the autumn of 1940, a submarine surfaces in the darkness inside a convoy column. Not outside it, inside it, between the ships. The merchant vessels moving around it in the night have no idea it is there. Their engines are louder than anything the submarine's low diesel rumble produces. The darkness is total, except for the shapes of hulls and the occasional white of a bow wave. The commander standing on the bridge of that submarine is 28 years old. He picks his target, he fires one torpedo, and he moves to the next ship. One torpedo, one ship. He does not fire spreads to compensate for distance or darkness or the movement of the target. He is close enough that missing would require a specific navigational error. He has put himself inside the convoy deliberately because he calculated, correctly, that the escorts on the perimeter cannot attack him there without risking the vessels they are protecting. That commander is Otto Kretschmer, and the method he develops across 18 months of operational patrols produces a tonnage record that no submarine commander of any navy in the Second World War ever surpasses. 44 ships, approximately 273,000 tons, 16 patrols, 18 months. Those numbers sit in the official records with a precision that the British post-war analysis of merchant shipping losses confirms rather than questions, because Kretschmer himself is meticulous about documentation, and because the ships he sinks stay sunk in places where their absence from subsequent convoys can be verified. The record is not mythology, it is arithmetic, and it is more impressive the longer you examine the conditions under which it is built. Otto Wilhelm August Kretschmer is born in Haidau, Silesia, on May 26, 1912, the son of a schoolteacher, not a naval family, with no particular reason his life should end up measured in tonnage at the bottom of the Atlantic. He enters the German Navy in 1930, goes through the submarine training that Germany quietly expands through the mid-30s under the terms of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935, and arrives at his first command, a small coastal submarine called U-23, with the kind of methodical temperament that his later career reflects at every stage. U-23 is not the boat that makes the record. It is the boat where the habits form. The coastal waters of the North Sea teach a commander things that the open Atlantic later demands in higher stakes. How to read the water. How to judge distance at night without instruments that do not exist yet. How to hold the patience that submarine command requires when patience is the difference between a firing solution and an empty sea. Kretschmer is not a man who confuses aggression with recklessness. He is a man who calculates what the risk permits and then commits to it completely. He transitions to U-99 in April 1940, and the operational record begins in earnest. U-99 is a Type 7B, 66 meters of steel hull carrying 14 torpedoes, and the crew of roughly 44 men who operate it. It is not a large boat. The living space available to those men across a 6 to 8 week patrol is roughly equivalent to a long corridor with machinery in it. The bunk space is shared. Men sleep in shifts, climbing into beds still warm from the previous watch, because there are not enough bunks for everyone simultaneously. The smell of diesel fuel, salt water, and the accumulated presence of 44 bodies in a sealed environment is something every U-boat veteran describes without being asked, because it is the smell of the entire war compressed into a steel tube. Kretschmer takes U-99 out of German ports, and later from French Biscay bases, into the convoy routes of the North Atlantic, and he begins applying the inside the convoy tactic at a consistency that the tonnage record reflects. The year 1940 is a specific window in the Atlantic War, a period when Allied convoy defenses are still developing the technologies and the experience that later closed the ocean around the U-boats. Radar that can detect a surfaced submarine at night does not yet exist in quantity. The escort vessels protecting convoys are often too few for the routes they cover. And the darkness over the North Atlantic in autumn and winter is the kind of complete darkness that coastal populations do not encounter. No ambient light, no horizon line, just the sound of your own ship and whatever the void around it contains. In that environment, Kretschmer's method works with a terrible efficiency. He approaches a convoy on the surface in darkness, tracking the column formations by the shapes of the hulls against whatever starlight or phosphorescence the sea provides. He times his penetration to the escort patrol cycles, finding the gap in the screen and moving through it at low diesel power, matching the convoy's 7 to 9 knot speed, so his engine noise dissolves into the mechanical background of dozens of merchant vessels running simultaneously. Inside the columns, he is effectively invisible to the ASDIC sonar, optimized for detecting submerged submarines, and visually indistinguishable from the ships around him to any lookout whose attention is directed outward toward the submarine threat that is supposed to be outside the convoy. His most productive single night comes against Convoy SC7 in October 1940. SC7 sails from Sydney, Nova Scotia, carrying 35 merchant ships toward Britain on the convoy routes that represent the circulatory system of Britain's ability to continue the war. Food, fuel, steel, ammunition. The cargo in those holds is the physical substance of national survival, measured in hundreds of thousands of tons, crossing the Atlantic in steady rotation. The convoy's escort consists of 2 sloops, 2 vessels protecting 35 ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. Kretschmer enters the columns that night and sinks 7 ships. The total runs to approximately 53,000 tons in one extended engagement. Ships going dark one after another across the darkness, while the escorts attempt to locate an attacker they cannot find, because they are searching outside a perimeter he never crossed. The efficiency that the 1 torpedo per ship methodology produces across the record is something I noticed while cross-referencing his patrol logs against the British merchant shipping loss records. The average German U-boat commander across the war's full duration expends considerably more than 1 torpedo per confirmed sinking, because the standard, longer-range submerged attack involves accuracy variables that spread firing compensates for statistically. Kretschmer's close-range method removes those variables. He is not firing and hoping. He is firing at a target he can see from a position that makes missing an anomaly rather than a probability. 1 torpedo per ship, across 44 ships. The career ends on March 17, 1941, in the North Atlantic while operating against convoy HX-112. U-99 takes damage in the engagement with HMS Walker and HMS Vanock, 2 destroyers commanded by Captain Donald McIntyre, who has specifically been hunting the leading U-boat aces. Kretschmer orders the submarine scuttled to prevent capture. The crew abandons ship into the North Atlantic in March. Water cold enough to kill in minutes. Darkness. Oil on the surface from the damaged boat. The men are pulled from the water by HMS Walker. Kretschmer is among them. The same night, HMS Vanock rams and sinks U-100, killing Joachim Schepke, another leading ace. 3 weeks earlier, on March 8th, HMS Wolverine had sunk U-47 and killed Gunther Prien. The 3 most successful U-boat commanders of the first phase of the Atlantic campaign are removed from operational service in a 2-week period. The coincidence strains credibility when you first encounter it in the historical record, but the documents confirm it without ambiguity. Kretschmer spends the rest of the war as a prisoner at Camp Bowmanville in Ontario, Canada. The statistical irony of this is not subtle. The loss rate among active U-boat crews reaches approximately 70% by the war's end, which means the man who holds the tonnage record survives precisely because he was captured before the campaign that built his record turns into the slaughter of 1943 and 44. The ocean that he outpaced for 18 months claims most of the men who continue fighting it after he leaves. He is released in December 1947. He eventually rises to Rear Admiral in the post-war West German Bundesmarine. He dies on August 5, 1998, at 86 years old, long enough to see his record discussed in documentaries, academic papers, and military histories that continue arguing about whether his method or his nerve, or simply the specific window of the war he operated in, explains the numbers. The answer is probably all three in a combination that the record documents but does not fully decompose. If the evening has wound down around you now, and you are somewhere comfortable, and the kind of tired that comes from a full day has started softening the edges of things, let the North Atlantic sit in your mind for a moment. Not the dramatic surface action where U-99 finally goes down, but the earlier nights. The ones where a 28-year-old commander stands on the bridge of a submarine, between the hulls of ships he is about to sink, the diesel engines low, the darkness complete. The convoy moving around him at 9 knots without any idea he is there. Whatever you think about the war, about the cargo in those ships, about the men on them, the sheer nerve of that position is something the record cannot explain away. This is the entire history of Otto Kretschmer, the tonnage king of the Second World War. There is a number. It sits at the center of this entire story. And I want to tell you up front that historians can't fully agree on what it is. Some sources say 274,333 tons. Others say 274,418. One respected German database puts it at 273,073, across only 46 ships rather than 47. The range between the lowest and highest credible estimates is roughly 2,375 gross register tons, approximately the cargo capacity of one medium-sized freighter. Somewhere in that gap is a vessel that may or may not belong to one man's account. The discrepancy isn't a scandal, and it isn't incompetence. It's the genuine, grinding difficulty of reconciling wartime radio reports with post-war Allied shipping registers, each compiled under pressure, each carrying its own errors. Most documentaries about Otto Kretschmer present his tonnage total as a clean, settled fact. It isn't. And I think that matters. Because if we can't get the number right, we should at least be honest about why. Gross register tons, first of all, isn't a weight. That surprises people. It's a volumetric measurement, a calculation of a ship's enclosed usable space, expressed historically in units of 100 cubic feet each. When Dönitz and his staff in Paris and later Lorient tracked the running total of ships sent to the bottom, they weren't measuring how much the ocean floor had received in terms of physical mass. They were measuring cargo capacity. A tanker loaded to the brim with aviation fuel might weigh twice its gross register tonnage in actual displacement. A cargo ship hauling timber for ballast might weigh considerably less. When the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the commander of all German submarines, set his monthly targets in terms of gross register tons, he was making a specific strategic argument that Britain's ability to sustain itself depended on a flow of goods through its ports, and that flow could be expressed and measured in tonnage. The calculation was clean in theory. In practice, the records were kept by human clerks, in real time, under the pressure of a global war, cross-referencing their kill claims against pre-war editions of Lloyd's Register of Shipping, a British publication the Germans had obtained before 1939 and were using as their primary reference throughout the campaign. If the ship wasn't in Lloyd's, its tonnage was estimated from silhouette recognition. There was room for error at every step. What made Kretschmer's running total even harder to pin down was something specific to him personally. He was famously reluctant to transmit radio signals during his patrols. He'd earned a nickname because of this, Stiller Otto in German, which translates roughly as Silent Otto. And it wasn't just a character trait. It was a deliberate tactical decision rooted in the understanding that every radio transmission could potentially be triangulated by British shore-based direction-finding stations. Other commanders radioed their kill reports in something close to real time. Kretschmer didn't. He came home, debriefed, and the staff at Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote reconstructed his patrol from his account. Parts of his running total were, in effect, a post hoc ledger rather than a live feed. This means the official war record of the most successful submarine commander in history is partly a retrospective document. I find that more interesting than troubling. It tells you something essential about the man before we've even met him properly. Dönitz, for his part, had set out his strategic arithmetic with some clarity before the war even began in earnest. In a memorandum circulated within the Oberkommando der Marine, the Navy's high command, he argued that destroying between 600,000 and 700,000 gross register tons of Allied shipping per month would exceed the combined ability of Britain and the United States to replace those losses through new construction, and that sustaining this rate for long enough would produce a terminal supply crisis. It was a rational argument. It was also an argument that required things Dönitz never had: enough submarines, enough trained crews, enough months without the Allies adapting. Kretschmer's entire career total, across 18 months of active command, amounts to roughly 40% of a single month's target under this formula. That puts his achievement in a frame that most popular accounts don't bother with. He was extraordinary by any measure of individual performance. He was also, in the grand strategic ledger, a fraction. When Kretschmer sent his final signal from U-99 on the 16th of March 1941, it read, according to the accounts transmitted to the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote: 2 destroyers, depth charges, 50,000 tons, Kretschmer. Post-war British Admiralty reconciliation of his final patrol, against confirmed convoy records for HX-112, suggests the actual tonnage figure for that patrol was closer to 42,000 gross register tons. His self-reported total was therefore roughly 19% higher than the best available confirmed figure. Now, and this is the crucial context, that signal was transmitted while U-99 was under fire from British destroyers, with her crew preparing to abandon ship and the boat itself taking on water. This wasn't a man carefully cross-referencing Lloyd's register. This was a man signalling his service under enormous stress, in what may have been among the last moments of his command. Holding that 19% gap against him as evidence of dishonesty would be absurd. But acknowledging it matters, because it's where the myth and the record quietly diverge. The golden horseshoe painted on U-99's conning tower is the image most people associate with Kretschmer, and there's a story behind why he reportedly disliked the word luck as an explanation for his results. He didn't think what he did was luck. He had a written doctrine, 11 specific points of submarine warfare that he'd refined across the late 1930s, during training commands, during the months on the small Type 2 U-boats in the North Sea. Point 8. Fire 1 torpedo per target, not fanned salvos. Point 9. Fire at close range. Point 10. Once an attack is launched, do not submerge except in circumstances of dire necessity. These aren't the instincts of a gambler. They're the operating principles of an engineer. The horseshoe was applied to his boat by tradition, by crew culture, by the institutional mythology the Kriegsmarine desperately needed. Kretschmer, by all credible accounts, preferred the arithmetic. The horse could keep its shoe. The question of what those numbers actually mean, not in terms of record keeping, but in terms of the physical world, is one I keep returning to. 2,375 gross register tons is approximately the combined cargo capacity of the Norwegian freighter Fredville, lost in January 1940, and the Danish Scotia, lost in December 1939. Real ships, real crews, real cargoes in the cold North Sea. The gap in the record isn't an abstraction. It's a question of whether specific vessels and specific people belong on one man's account or not. The post-war Allied reconciliation of U-boat claims against confirmed sinkings found discrepancies throughout the fleet, not only with Kretschmer. Commanders tended to overclaim. The chaos of a night convoy attack, with multiple submarines operating simultaneously, made attribution genuinely difficult, even with good faith on all sides. But Kretschmer's overclaim rate, to the extent it can be calculated, was actually lower than average for the Atlantic campaign. The gap exists. It's smaller than most. The Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote's own war diary, the Kriegstagebuch, or KTB, recorded Kretschmer's cumulative total, passing 200,000 gross register tons, somewhere in the aftermath of the October 1940 convoy battles. Historians who've worked with that document note that the handwriting changes partway through the relevant entry, suggesting a different clerk took over mid-record. That's a small detail in isolation. It becomes slightly less small when you remember that this handwriting change sits inside the most important single running tally of the entire U-boat war. Even the recorder of the record wasn't constant. In the archive, nothing is clean. That's not a complaint. It's an instruction about how to read what follows. Everything in this story comes to us through someone's hand, someone's memory, someone's institutional incentive, including, eventually, Kretschmer's own. If we're going to take the tonnage record seriously, we have to take the methodology seriously. And the methodology, as I've tried to show, has fractures. Not fatal fractures. The basic shape of what Kretschmer did, 46 or 47 ships, across 18 months, a total somewhere between 272,000 and 274,000 gross register tons, is not in doubt. What's in doubt is the fourth and fifth significant figure. That may sound like academic hair-splitting, but the entire edifice of his historical reputation, the entire claim that he was the most successful submarine commander of any navy in the Second World War, rests on that number being larger than anyone else's. His nearest rival in the German service finished with a lower confirmed total. The margin is real, it's just not as clean as the legend requires. He earned the record, he held it, but the record itself is a document, and documents have authors, and authors make choices. What this documentary is, at its core, is an attempt to sit with that complexity without flinching from it, and without pretending it makes the man smaller than he was, because it doesn't. 272,000 gross register tons across 18 months, whatever the precise figure, is a number that has not been approached by any submarine commander since. It stands, 85 years on, not because the world has run out of submarines, but because the conditions that made it possible, the open convoys, the absent radar, the incomplete code breaking, the temporary vacuum of the 1940 Atlantic, will never return. The record is safe. What we're going to do now is figure out what kind of man built it and what it actually cost. On the 1st of May 1912, in a small settlement called Heidau, near the town of Nysa in the province of Silesia, then part of the German Empire, now part of southern Poland, a schoolteacher's wife gave birth to a boy named Otto Wilhelm August Kretschmer. His father, Friedrich Wilhelm Otto Kretschmer, ran the local primary school, the Volksschule, where young Otto himself would sit as a pupil from 1918 until 1921. The family was not wealthy. They weren't politically prominent. They were the kind of solid, educated, lower middle-class German household that produced administrators and teachers, and occasionally naval officers. The world into which Otto was born was still the confident, industrializing world of the late Kaiser's Germany. But by the time he was 6 years old, that world had collapsed entirely. and the Germany he grew up in was the fractured, humiliated, economically desperate Weimar Republic. The Kretschmer family, by the biographical accounts we have, stayed aloof from the turbulence. Friedrich kept teaching, Otto kept learning. His school-leaving certificate, the Abitur, the German academic qualification that functions as a gateway to university and professional life, contained a line that has been quoted in almost every account of his life written since. The evaluator wrote that Kretschmer had demonstrated his extraordinary courage in many instances, and noted that he wants to be a naval officer. That sentence was written when he was 17 years old. It's tempting to read it as prophecy. It's more honest to read it as documentation, evidence that a specific characteristic had already been identified, in bureaucratic language, by someone whose job it was to assess young men's futures. He wasn't born a naval officer. Someone noticed that he could become one. There's a difference. He was too young to enlist at 17. The regulations were clear. His father's response to this gap was, in retrospect, one of the more consequential parental decisions in this story. He sent Otto to England, specifically to what was then called the University College of the Southwest of England, now the University of Exeter, where Otto studied under a professor named Jacob Wilhelm Schopp. Schopp was German-born, but had become a naturalized British citizen, which made him a peculiar but entirely appropriate teacher for a young man navigating the border between two cultures that were still, in 1929, defining their relationship with each other in the aftermath of a catastrophic war. Kretschmer stayed long enough to master the English language. He came to respect what he described, through later accounts, as the practical focus of British education. The way it complemented, rather than duplicated, his more theoretical German schooling. He left, not because his year was up, but because his mother died of tetanus, the result of medical malpractice. He came home for grief. He didn't go back. He travelled instead, France, Switzerland, Italy, before finally presenting himself at the Reichsmarine on the 1st of April 1930 as a sea officer candidate. He was 18 years old. He joined what was called Crew 30, the incoming class of officer candidates for that year, 78 young men in total. Basic military training in Stralsund, then a transfer to the training ship Niobe. Then, beginning in October of that year, a 14-month voyage aboard the cruiser Emden that took him through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal into the waters of Ceylon, the Philippines, China, Japan, Guam, South Africa, Angola, and Spain. When he returned to Wilhelmshaven in December of 1931, he had covered approximately 38,000 nautical miles. He had seen the world's great maritime routes from the deck of a German warship. He had learned, in the most physical possible way, what those ocean highways carried and why they mattered. This wasn't abstract strategic education. It was an empirical education in global commerce. The training that followed was methodical to a degree that seems almost industrial when you read through its components. Artillery course at Kiel, April to June 1933. Torpedo course at Mervik, June to August. Anti-aircraft artillery course at Wilhelmshaven, August. Communications course, September. First U-boat course, late September to early October. He was being assembled, component by component, like a precision instrument. What's worth noting is that none of these courses, not a single one, in the pre-1935 curriculum, appears to have included formal ideological instruction. He was being trained as a naval technician in the tradition of the Reichsmarine, which was a professional corps built on technical competence and institutional continuity with the Imperial Navy, rather than on political allegiance. The Nazi transformation of the armed forces after 1935 grafted a new set of requirements onto this existing structure. Kretschmer was already a formed officer by the time that graft occurred. He'd been commissioned as a Lieutenant zur See, acting sub-lieutenant, on the 1st of October 1934. One historian writing about Kretschmer described him as a patriot loyal to the government, who nonetheless eschewed Nazi efforts to glorify his success through propaganda. The British Naval Intelligence Interrogation Report from April 1941, the most detailed contemporaneous psychological assessment of the man that survives, puts it slightly differently, noting that his political views were less extremely Nazi than had been assumed. These two characterizations are consistent with each other, and they're consistent with what the biographical record suggests about his behavior throughout his career. He performed the required rituals of the regime. He accepted its decorations. He served its military objectives with exceptional skill, and he appears to have maintained a degree of personal distance from its political apparatus. Whether that distance constitutes moral independence or simply professional compartmentalization is a question I don't think the historical record allows us to resolve cleanly. A 1940 newsreel shows him receiving his Knight's Cross from Grand Admiral Raeder and rendering the required salute with practiced ease. The private skeptic and the public performer were the same body, on the same day, in the same uniform. There is one incident from his pre-war submarine service that I keep returning to because it says something about the kind of professional environment he was learning in. His first operational assignment as a lieutenant was aboard U-35 in 1937, serving under Commander Hans Rudolf Rosing. During a training dive, Rosing submerged the boat while Kretschmer was still on the bridge. He was left in the North Sea, clinging to the periscope housing, hoping someone below would notice his absence before hypothermia or the sea decided the matter. He was eventually missed, the boat surfaced, and he was recovered. That's the kind of event that either breaks a man's relationship with submarines entirely or teaches him something fundamental about what inattention costs. He drew, by all evidence, the latter lesson. In his 11 points of submarine warfare, the very first two concern lookouts and early target detection. Not torpedoes, not tactics, the eyes. He learned, in the most immediate possible way, that the ocean doesn't forgive distraction. He took interim command of U-35 for 2 weeks in August of 1937, when the boat's new commander was killed in a car accident. The patrol was in the Bay of Biscay, off the Spanish coast during the Civil War period. The crew went ashore at the resort town of San Sebastian. No ships were sunk. The patrol was, by the measure of later events, entirely uneventful. But it was a command. His first. He was 25 years old. On the 1st of October 1937, he was given permanent command of U-23, and the real work began. The 11 points deserve attention as a document because they read less like tactical philosophy and more like a troubleshooting manual. Point 3. Lone ships should be attacked on the surface with gunfire to save expensive torpedoes. Point 5. Convoys should be attacked in daylight only if it isn't feasible to wait for nightfall. Point 6. Attack at night from the dark side of the convoy so the target is silhouetted against the lighter sky and the submarine remains in shadow. Point 7. When there is little moonlight, attack from the windward side to avoid showing a white bow wave when motoring into the wind. These aren't the principles of a man who was improvising. They were developed across the late 1930s, during peacetime training, when he had the luxury of thinking systematically about problems that other commanders were still solving by instinct in wartime. That systematic quality, the application of engineering logic to tactical situations, was, as far as I can tell, the essential characteristic that separated his record from those of equally brave and experienced commanders. His father sent him to England. His teachers noted his courage. His commander left him in the sea. He travelled the world's trade routes on a training cruiser. He wrote 11 rules for fighting a war that hadn't started yet. None of these facts, in isolation, makes him exceptional. What made him exceptional was what he did with all of them when 1939 arrived. When the arithmetic of the Atlantic suddenly started mattering in ways that no training exercise had quite prepared the world for. The Type 2B submarine is not a vessel that inspires awe. It displaces 279 tons on the surface, roughly the weight of a small coastal ferry. It measures 42.7 meters from bow to stern and 4.1 meters across the pressure hull at its widest point. The control room, where the commanding officer stood and made his decisions, was approximately 2.5 meters in diameter. The entire crew complement was 25 men, and the torpedo loadout, the total offensive capacity of this machine, was 5 weapons, 3 forward tubes, 2 reloads. When those were gone, the boat had to return to port. There was no resupply at sea, no alternative magazine to draw from. 5 shots, that was the entire budget. I want you to hold that number in mind as this chapter unfolds, because it explains almost everything about how Otto Kretschmer fought on U-23 and why he fought the way he did. He took his first war patrol in command of U-23 on the 25th of August, 1939, a week before Germany invaded Poland and formally began the conflict in Europe. The boat went into the North Sea, tracked along the Dutch coast, and returned to Wilhelmshaven on the 4th of September without having sunk anything. Second patrol, the 9th to the 21st of September, nothing. The Type 2B's operational range was its first and most serious constraint. Its diesel engines produced a combined 700 brake horsepower, which gave it a surface speed of approximately 13 knots and a practical operational radius of roughly 1,700 nautical miles at 10 knots. That sounds adequate until you recall that the entry point to the North Atlantic shipping lanes, the area where the convoys were running, lay far beyond that radius from Wilhelmshaven or Kiel. U-23 couldn't reach the Atlantic. She was a North Sea boat, confined to the shallower, colder, more intensively patrolled waters between Britain's eastern coast, the Orkney Islands, and the Norwegian approaches. This wasn't the open ocean hunting ground that would define Kretschmer's reputation. This was a different kind of war. On the 4th of October, 1939, his third patrol produced his first confirmed kill, the Glenfarg, a coastal freighter of 876 gross register tons, carrying pulp and ferrochrome. The vessel was small. The cargo was industrial. Kretschmer's war diary records that he waited for the crew to take to their lifeboats before firing the single torpedo that sank her. 1 torpedo, 1 ship. The Glenfarg went down. He returned to port. The pattern was established before the philosophy had been formally articulated. He didn't fire salvos at the Glenfarg because he couldn't afford to waste a salvo on a target that didn't require one. Economy forced the doctrine before the doctrine was written. The underwater performance of the Type 2B was, by any measure, terrifying to operate in rather than terrifying to face. Submerged on her electric motors, she made 6.9 knots, roughly walking pace for a large man, and sustained that speed for approximately 3.5 hours before her batteries were exhausted. 3.5 hours. That is not a submarine in the sense we understand today, with nuclear boats capable of staying submerged for months. That's a torpedo tube with a crew compartment and a battery pack. Every moment spent underwater was a moment eating into a resource that, once gone, couldn't be replenished until the boat surfaced and ran her diesels. This constraint made Kretschmer's insistence on surface attacks not merely a tactical preference, but a physical necessity. He couldn't hide underwater for extended periods. The boat wouldn't allow it. The waters he was operating in, the shallow North Sea, the approaches to the Orkneys, the coastal passages off eastern Scotland, were precisely the most dangerous waters for a surface submarine, heavily patrolled and with ASDIC-equipped escorts regularly crossing his potential operating areas. That he achieved anything at all in these conditions is, frankly, remarkable. Though I'll use that word only once and not again, because his methods were not luck. The 5th Patrol, in December of 1939, took U-23 into the inner waters around the Orkney Islands, in the aftermath of Gunther Preen's famous attack on Scapa Flow. Kretschmer sank the Danish Scotia, 2,400 gross register tons, after her darkened hull aroused his suspicion during a night approach. 19 men were killed in that sinking. 2 were saved. It's worth sitting with those numbers plainly. This is where the technical and the human exist in the same sentence, and there's no comfortable way to hold them simultaneously. He was operating within the established, if contested, legal framework of submarine warfare, against ships that could plausibly be carrying war materials. The Scotia's darkening, her deliberately switched-off navigation lights, put her in the category of a vessel taking precautions associated with military cargo. He judged her a legitimate target and fired. 19 men did not survive the judgment. The 6th Patrol, in January of 1940, produced 2 notable sinkings that demonstrated the range of what U-23 was capable of, even within her severe limitations. On the 11th of January, the Norwegian Fredville, 1,150 gross register tons, was sunk without warning, the single torpedo killing 11 of her 16 crew. The following day, Kretschmer attacked and sank the Danish tanker Denmark, 10,517 gross register tons, while she lay at anchor in Ingeness Bay at Kirkwall in the Orkneys. There were no deaths among the Denmark's crew. The ship was loaded with oil intended for British warships at Scapa Flow. Kretschmer's own war diary, as cross-referenced by Norwegian historian Geir Haar's research, doesn't appear to record the nature of the cargo. He may not have known what he'd actually hit. The strategic value of the kill, depriving British capital ships of fuel, was, on this occasion, invisible to the man who achieved it. The 8th Patrol, in February of 1940, was the culmination of Kretschmer's time on U-23, and it was conducted at a pace and with a lethality that pointed toward everything that would follow on U-99. On the 18th of February, he sank HMS Daring, a 1930s destroyer of approximately 1,375 tons, in the Pentland Firth while she was escorting convoy HN12 from Norway. A single torpedo fired on the surface at night. He ordered a turn and ran. The destroyers accompanying the convoy neither saw him nor detected him with ASDIC. 157 of the Daring's crew were killed, including her commanding officer. 5 survived. The next day he sank the Tibetan, 5,225 gross register tons, in the Moray Firth. All 33 men aboard died. The Loch Maddie followed on the 22nd of February, already torpedoed by another submarine and abandoned, finished off by Kretschmer. He returned to Wilhelmshaven on the 25th of February after 17 days at sea, his longest patrol on U-23. His torpedo complement was exhausted. The boat was done with the North Sea. The hit rate he was achieving by the end of his time on U-23 was already above fleet average. The precise calculation is difficult because the wartime records don't always distinguish clean misses from technical failures. Torpedo malfunctions were a persistent problem throughout the campaign, with the magnetic pistol fuses on the German G7A compressed air torpedo proving unreliable until engineering corrections were implemented in 1940. But Kretschmer's approach to these constraints was characteristic. He wasn't firing at long range in the hope that a salvo might bracket the target. He was closing to ranges, sometimes under 500 meters, sometimes considerably less, where the probability of a miss dropped towards zero. The mathematics of torpedo targeting at close range are dramatically more forgiving than at standard engagement distances. The time of flight shrinks, the deflection angle becomes nearly irrelevant, and the window for the target to maneuver out of the path closes to seconds rather than minutes. He wasn't being brave for the sake of it. He was being precise for the sake of efficiency. Those two things happen to require the same behavior. What the 8 patrols on U-23 produced in total was approximately 26,000 gross register tons of confirmed sinkings, including the warship. Across a maximum of 40 torpedoes, with a hit rate estimated at between 60 and 65%. This was training in the most brutal sense of the word. Not training in a classroom or a simulator, but training against real targets, in contested waters, with a machine that didn't give you many chances to make mistakes. The Type 2B's limitations forced discipline that a more capable boat might have allowed him to avoid. When he was given U-99, he would have more torpedoes, more range, more speed. He would have more room to operate. But the essential economy of means, one torpedo, one ship, fire only when you know it will hit, had been burned into his operating instincts by a boat that simply didn't have the luxury of waste. He left U-23 in April of 1940, ordered to the Germania-Werft shipyard in Kiel for construction training on his new command. The North Sea chapter was over. Ahead of him was a boat with 10 torpedoes, a range of 6,500 nautical miles, and access to the Atlantic. The arithmetic was about to change considerably. On the 2nd of April 1940, Otto Kretschmer reported to the Friedrich Krupp Germania-Werft shipyard in Kiel. Not to take command. Not for a ceremony. He went to learn the machine before he commanded it. For 2 weeks before U-99's commissioning date, he walked the build alongside the engineers, reviewed the engine room specifications, and familiarized himself with systems that his crew would be relying on in deep water months later. The commissioning entry in U-99's logbook, dated the 18th of April 1940, is exactly as undramatic as you'd expect from a document of that type. A serial number, a displacement figure, the notation Kretschmer, KL, Kapitän Leutnant, opposite the command line. Directly below, a fuel load of approximately 108 cubic meters of diesel oil. Not a speech, not a flag, a fuel figure. That's where the life of U-99 begins. The Type 7B submarine, of which U-99 was one example, represented a genuinely significant improvement over the Type 2 series in almost every measurable category, but it's important not to overstate the gulf. The 7B displaced 753 tons on the surface, more than 2.5 times the 2B's surface displacement, and 915 tons submerged. It carried 10 torpedoes across 4 forward tubes and a single stern tube, with 5 reloads available. Its MAN diesel engines produced a combined 1,400 brake horsepower and drove the boat to a surface speed of approximately 17.5 knots, compared to the 2B's 13. The operational range was approximately 6,500 nautical miles at 10 knots, more than 3 times what U-23 could manage, which meant that for the first time, Kretschmer could operate not in the shallow, monitored North Sea, but in the broad mid-Atlantic, where convoys ran with thinner escorts, and where the distances between threat and help were measured in hundreds of miles rather than dozens. The stern tube, the single backward-facing torpedo launch point, is a detail worth dwelling on, because it illuminates something specific about the relationship between weapon design and tactical psychology. Kretschmer, by the available evidence, rarely used it. His 11 points of submarine warfare were built around close-range bow-on attacks, driving the boat directly at its target rather than maneuvering for a stern shot. But the stern tube's presence as a last resort option changed the calculation of risk inside a convoy screen. He knew, somewhere in the back of his operational mind, that if things went wrong in the middle of a convoy, if he'd fired his forward shots and needed to run, there was one more weapon pointing the other way. I think that knowledge, more than the tube's actual deployment, contributed to the aggression he brought to convoy penetration. It's the difference between knowing there's an exit and actually using one. The first patrol on U-99 ended with what should have been a completely avoidable indignity. On the 21st of June, 1940, 3 days into the patrol, U-99 was attacked by an Arado R-196 floatplane from the German battleship Scharnhorst. The aircraft's crew had misidentified the submarine as British. The boat survived with damage. The patrol was aborted. The premier U-boat of the German Navy's most successful commander had nearly been sunk by the German Navy before firing a single shot in the Atlantic. The war diary records this without apparent humor, because the war diary wasn't written for humor. The coordination failure between the Kriegsmarine surface fleet and the U-boat arm had been a problem since the beginning of the war, and it never received a satisfactory solution. Kretschmer returned to port, the boat was repaired, and on the 27th of June, he put to sea again for his 10th war patrol, the first that would demonstrate what U-99 was capable of. That 10th patrol, from the 27th of June to the 21st of July, 1940, produced more than 20,000 gross register tons of confirmed sinkings. Let that settle for a moment. His entire career on U-23, across 8 patrols spanning roughly 10 months, had yielded approximately 26,000 gross register tons. He nearly matched that in a single patrol on U-99. The upgrade wasn't a marginal improvement. It was a structural shift in capability, compressed into a matter of weeks. Among the vessels sunk was a small Estonian cargo ship called Meresar, 2,126 gross register tons, which produced the only instance of a vessel being captured rather than sunk during U-99's operational career. Kretschmer questioned her crew personally after they abandoned ship and sent a German prize crew aboard with orders to sail her to the French port of Bordeaux. German aircraft bombed and sank the Meresar 3 days later, killing the prize crew. The war diary entry for this episode, if it exists in the surviving records, has not been surfaced in any major biographical source. The silence is its own kind of document. During this same patrol, one of Kretschmer's more frequently cited moments of operational behavior occurred. A lone survivor was spotted on a raft, one man in the open Atlantic with no visible vessel nearby. Kretschmer ordered U-99 to backtrack through waters he'd already been operating in, increasing his exposure to patrol aircraft and escort vessels until they found the man. They gave him clothes and alcohol and transferred him to a lifeboat at the first opportunity. The historian Michael Sturmer, in his study of U-boat behavior towards survivors, describes such acts of assistance as selective and fickle, and that characterization strikes me as the most honest available framing. The backtrack to find the survivor happened. The 33 deaths on the Tibetan also happened. Both are part of the same operational record of the same commander. The file doesn't close neatly. What the admiral commanding the British Admiralty's anti-submarine warfare section later wrote about Kretschmer's convoy penetration technique is worth examining carefully, because it comes from a professional who should have understood exactly what he was seeing. Admiral Sir George Creasy, reviewing the reports from U-99's Atlantic patrols, included initially that the tactic of driving a surfaced submarine inside a convoy screen at night must have been done by mistake, that no rational commander would deliberately take his boat into the geometric center of the threat in order to attack from within. Creasy was wrong. U-99's own war diary documents the maneuver as deliberate, pre-planned, and executed repeatedly across multiple patrols. The mistake wasn't Kretschmer's. It was the Admiralty's initial failure to believe that anyone would actually do it. The misidentification by the Arado floatplane in June isn't just an anecdote about IFF failures. It points to a deeper structural problem in the German military's coordination between its naval surface forces and its submarine arm, a problem that was never fully resolved during the war and that would have direct operational consequences for U-boats operating in the Bay of Biscay and the Atlantic throughout the campaign. The Luftwaffe's reluctance to subordinate aircraft to naval command, a fight that Dönitz waged with increasing desperation throughout the war, left the U-boat arm without reliable air support for convoy spotting and, critically, without reliable protection from Allied maritime patrol aircraft during transit. When Kretschmer had his meeting with Hitler in November of 1940, following his Knight's Cross with oak leave ceremony, the single point he reportedly pressed, according to the biographical accounts, was the need for Luftwaffe air support. Raeder, who was present, already knew. The argument was going nowhere. By the time U-99 docked in Lorient on the 21st of July 1940, at the end of that 10th patrol, the strategic geography of the war at sea had already been transformed by an event on land. France had fallen in June. The armistice signed by the French government in late June had handed Germany the Atlantic coast, and with it the ports of Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. For the U-boat arm, this was not a diplomatic abstraction. It was a reduction of approximately 1,200 nautical miles each way in transit distance to the Atlantic hunting grounds. Roughly 20 to 30% more productive time at sea per patrol, without a single additional submarine being built or a single additional crew being trained. Kretschmer's 10th through 16th patrols all departed from and returned to Lorient. Remove the French bases from the equation, and his Atlantic tonnage is probably between 20 and 25% lower. The map had changed. The arithmetic followed. There's a document I want to tell you about before we get into the operational detail of what happened between the autumn of 1940 and the spring of 1941. It's the Admiralty's monthly anti-submarine report for October of that year. It's a bureaucratic document, plain, functional prose, the kind of writing that exists to convey information efficiently to the people who need to make decisions based on it. It records that Convoy SC7, departing Sydney, Nova Scotia, for Liverpool, lost 20 ships out of 35 during its October crossing. 20 ships out of 35. 59% of the convoy's merchant vessels, gone in a single passage. The document uses passive voice throughout. Ships were sunk. No commanders are named. No submarines are identified. The architecture of institutional grief is passive by design, because naming the cause would require admitting, in writing, that the defences had failed. The total tonnage lost by SC7 was 79,592 gross register tons. Kretschmer personally accounted for 6 of those 20 ships, disabling a 7th. He fired 14 torpedoes across the night of the 18th to the 19th of October, 1940. 13 of them found targets. His hit rate for that single operational period, 92.8%. The period from June to November 1940 has acquired a German nickname in the historical literature. Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. German U-boat commanders used it themselves, and the phrase has travelled into English language history largely intact. It's worth interrogating what happy meant in operational terms, because it wasn't primarily a matter of morale or individual skill. It was a matter of a specific, temporary defensive vacuum that the Allied convoy system entered and had not yet exited. The British convoy escort program in the summer and autumn of 1940 was suffering from the consequences of the Norwegian campaign, the Dunkirk evacuation, and the need to retain destroyers in British home waters against the possibility of a German invasion. Escorts were thin, inexperienced, and frequently operating without radar. The routing staff at the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Centre was working with fragmentary information, incomplete SIGINT, delayed survivor reports, after-action accounts that took days to reach London and be processed. Against this backdrop, a commander who attacked from inside the convoy screen, on the surface, at night, was exploiting not one tactical advantage, but a constellation of them simultaneously. Convoy HX-72, which Kretschmer attacked in September of 1940, before SC-7, produced a different kind of record. A loose grouping of U-boats converged on the convoy over several nights. Kretschmer in U-99, Joachim Schepke in U-100, Heinrich Bleichrodt in U-48, and others. Kretschmer sank 1 ship. Schepke sank 7. The disparity in kills on that patrol has been noted by historians, but rarely explained satisfactorily. What U-99's war diary does record is Kretschmer's clinical observation that the British escorts did not know how to help during the attack and were wasting star shells by firing them on a moonlit night, when the illumination they provided was negligible compared to the ambient light already available. This isn't the comment of a man who was relieved to have evaded detection. It's the comment of a professional assessing a competitor's performance and finding it poor. 3 British armed merchant cruisers were sunk by Kretschmer in November and December of 1940. HMS Laurentic, HMS Patroclus, and HMS Forfar. The first 2 were attacked on the night of the 3rd to 4th of November in a prolonged engagement that consumed a disproportionate number of Kretschmer's torpedoes and produced a specific frustration recorded in his war diary. Both Laurentic and Patroclus had been loaded with wooden barrels in their lower spaces to increase their buoyancy, a deliberate British countermeasure intended to make torpedo damage less immediately fatal to vessels that might otherwise sink quickly and cleanly. It took 9 torpedoes and 1 dud to sink them both. Kretschmer was forced to use his deck gun at one point when a ship appeared to be resisting torpedo damage, then was driven below by the ship's return fire. He described in the war diary's terms a methodical process of destruction that became increasingly expensive in terms of torpedoes per kill. The wooden barrel trick wasn't a secret. It was a known British practice. What Kretschmer hadn't encountered before was ships that absorbed this much punishment without going under. He adapted. Both ships eventually sank. The targeting optic Kretschmer used for his surface attacks deserves a specific technical explanation, because it goes to the heart of why his methods worked when other commanders didn't. The UZO, Überwasserzieloptik, which translates roughly as surface targeting optic, was a binocular device mounted on U-99's bridge, with 7 times magnification and a bearing ring calibrated in degrees. The UZO wasn't a radar system. It didn't see through darkness or identify targets at extreme range. What it did was allow the commander, standing on the bridge at night, to take a precise bearing on a silhouetted target and feed that bearing, together with estimated target speed and U-99's own speed, into the torpedo data computer, the TDC, mounted below in the control room. The TDC then calculated the firing solution, the angle at which a torpedo needed to be launched to intercept a moving target. At the standard engagement distance of approximately 1,500 meters, the calculation was sensitive to small errors in target speed estimation, and a deflection of a few degrees could mean a clean miss. At Kretschmer's preferred engagement range of under 500 meters, sometimes under 300, the time of flight was under 30 seconds, the deflection angle was nearly irrelevant, and the window for error collapsed toward nothing. He wasn't a better mathematician than his peers. He was closer. Proximity was the system. The ASDIC limitation that made all of this possible is a technical detail that's crucial to understanding why Kretschmer's surface penetration method worked consistently rather than just occasionally. British Type 144 ASDIC, the primary underwater detection equipment used by SC-7's escorts in October 1940, worked by emitting sound pulses and detecting their reflections from submarine hulls. It was designed for submerged detection, optimized for the acoustic signature of a submarine's pressure hull moving through water at a depth of at least several meters. Against a surfaced vessel, particularly one whose diesel exhaust and propeller wash was masked by the background noise generated by 35 merchant ships running their own engines simultaneously, it provided essentially no reliable indication. The surface of the ocean was the blind spot. Kretschmer had found it and was operating inside it, at close range, for hours at a time. The escort commander's after-action report for SC-7 states that no U-boat was detected inside the convoy screen during the night of the 18th to 19th of October, 1940. Kretschmer's own war diary confirms he was inside the screen for approximately 4 hours during that same night. These two documents describe the same stretch of ocean on the same night from opposite perspectives, and they tell fundamentally different stories about what happened and what was known. Both are primary sources. Both are credible within their limitations. This is what working with a genuine historical archive feels like. Not a contradiction to be resolved, but a gap to be acknowledged. The invisible partner in every one of Kretschmer's surface attacks was a man named Heinrich Petersen, his helmsman, Stabsobersteuermann. Petersen served in that role across every single war patrol on both U-23 and U-99, a continuity of service that was unusual even within the intense crew bonding typical of submarine service. When Kretschmer maneuvered U-99 through a convoy screen at night, making course corrections by hand signals and verbal commands in near total darkness on an open bridge, it was Petersen below at the wheel, translating those commands into the precise movements that kept the boat on its attack line without generating a visible bow wave. Kretschmer recommended him personally for the Knight's Cross in November of 1940, citing his role in saving U-99 from enemy detection across 12 patrols. The recommendation was approved on the 5th of November, 1940. What Petersen's specific actions were on any given night, the specific corrections, the judgments made below while Kretschmer was watching through the UZO, is not recorded in any surviving document. He was the invisible half of the precision instrument. By the time Kretschmer made his way to Berlin in early November of 1940 to receive his oak leaves from Grand Admiral Raeder, then met with Hitler at the Reich Chancellery, his running total had crossed the 200,000 gross register ton mark. He was, by any measure, the most productive submarine commander in the German service at that moment. What he chose to say to Hitler during what appears to have been a lunch attended also by the Soviet Foreign Minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, a meeting that the biographical record confirms occurred, but provides almost no detail about, is something history simply doesn't know. Larry Patterson's 1918 biography states plainly that Kretschmer's thoughts on Hitler and the subsequent conference are not known. That's an honest sentence from a careful historian. He sat at a table with some of the most consequential figures of the mid-20th century, and he left no record of what passed through his mind. The silence, again, is the data. There is a paragraph in the British Naval Intelligence Division's interrogation report on U-99, compiled in April of 1941. The document officially designated CB 04051, parenthesis 20. That is, I think, the most important paragraph about Otto Kretschmer in the entire documentary record. Not because of what it reveals about tactics or tonnage, but because of what it reveals about the man behind both. The interrogating officer wrote, "He gave the impression of being a quiet, deliberate man, and looked more like a student than a U-boat captain. He prided himself on being able to take advantage of whatever the passing moment offered, and made no elaborate plans for attacking convoys. He admitted that he had become weary of the war some time ago, and latterly had got no satisfaction from sinking ship after ship. That last sentence. He was 28 years old. He held the record, and he'd already emotionally disengaged from it before he was captured. His enemy knew this. His own service did not. I've spent considerable time with the archive looking for personal testimony from Kretschmer. Letters, diary entries, reflective writing of any kind. What the record reveals is an absence. He didn't write the way other commanders wrote. He didn't produce the memoir that the German public expected from its naval heroes. He cooperated with Terence Robertson's biographical project in the early 1950s, correcting factual errors and providing what amounts to an authorized account of his operational career. But he didn't, apparently, feel the need to go further. The 11 points of submarine warfare exist. The war diary entries exist: terse, navigational, professional. The interrogation report exists. Beyond that, we are reading the spaces between documents rather than the documents themselves. This is what the archive of a deliberate man looks like. The photograph exists, from a German newsreel, 1940, of Kretschmer receiving the Knight's Cross from Grand Admiral Raeder at Lorient. He's in naval uniform. He renders the required salute. He's 28 years old and has just returned from a patrol that produced tens of thousands of gross register tons. The propaganda apparatus of the Third Reich wanted him in that frame, performing that gesture, embodying that achievement. The private skepticism that the NID report later detected, the political distance, the genuine shock at the bombing of Buckingham Palace, the weariness, none of it is visible in that frame. Both things were true simultaneously, in the same person, on the same afternoon. This isn't hypocrisy in the way we usually mean that word. It's the condition of professional service in a regime that demands public performance, regardless of private conviction. He performed it. He also quietly remained something other than what the performance required. The rescued survivor in the raft, the man U-99 backtracked to find in the open Atlantic, appears in several accounts of Kretschmer's career as evidence of personal humanity. I want to treat it more carefully than that. The same commander who ordered U-99 to backtrack across already hunted waters to find a single man on a raft also left 33 men dead on the Tibetan without survivors. He sank the Norwegian Varild in January of 1940 without warning, killing all 15 crew, including the crew of a small coastal vessel whose nationality didn't fit neatly into the legal framework of unrestricted submarine warfare. His own point 4 states that survivors should be assisted when possible. Possible is doing considerable work in that sentence. The archive shows a man who, in specific circumstances, acted with what looks like genuine care for individual human beings in distress, and who, in other circumstances, fired a single torpedo and moved on. Both of those behaviors are documented. Neither cancels the other. The documentary record doesn't permit a clean verdict, and I'm not going to manufacture one. The Estonian ship Meresar, the only vessel captured rather than sunk during U-99's operational career, deserves more attention than it typically receives. Kretschmer boarded her, interrogated her crew, sent a German prize crew aboard with orders to sail her to Bordeaux, and then continued his patrol. 3 days later, German aircraft bombed and sank the Meresar, killing the prize crew. Kretschmer's response to this, in the war diary, is not recorded in any source I have found. He may not have known immediately. He may have learned later. He may have written something that hasn't survived. The prize crew were German sailors, killed by German aircraft because the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe couldn't coordinate their operations adequately. The same fundamental failure that had nearly destroyed U-99 on her first patrol when the Scharnhorst's float plane misidentified her. The Meresar episode brings these institutional failures together in a particularly bleak way. A captured ship, a prize crew, friendly fire, and a war diary entry that doesn't exist. His reluctance to transmit radio signals wasn't absolute, but it was dramatic by the standards of the Atlantic campaign, where other commanders regularly radioed their positions, their kill claims, and their tactical assessments to the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote. Kretschmer kept the ether quiet. This had tactical logic, as already noted. Every transmission was a potential position fix for British direction-finding stations. But it also produced a specific side effect. The German propaganda machine had less material to work with. The radio announcements of U-boat success that energized German public morale throughout the campaign depended on commanders who transmitted. Kretschmer's kills accumulated in silence and were announced only after his return to port, in retrospective summaries. The regime's PR apparatus built its narrative around the aces who talked. Kretschmer talked as little as possible. This isn't presented anywhere in the record as a political act. It was a tactical one. But it had the effect of creating a modest, quiet hero in a war that desperately wanted loud ones. His captured crew landed in Liverpool in March of 1941 and marched through streets where the city had taken heavy bombing and where the Battle of the Atlantic was a daily lived reality for the civilian population, were subjected to what the biographical accounts describe as missiles thrown by angry people. Kretschmer himself was transported separately, shielded from this. He was taken first to the London Cage, a military intelligence facility at No. 8 Kensington Palace Gardens, where the Naval Intelligence Division held valuable prisoners for initial questioning. Winston Churchill disclosed the capture to the House of Commons on the 21st of March, 1941. German radio acknowledged Kretschmer's capture and the death of Schepke, but didn't announce the loss of Gunther Prien, whose U-47 had disappeared in a depth charge attack 10 days earlier. The German propaganda apparatus calculated that announcing all three losses simultaneously, Prien, Schepke, Kretschmer, might damage civilian morale beyond recovery. Prien was kept officially alive for several more weeks after he was gone. The regime's relationship with its own people was mediated through this kind of careful management. The NID report's description of Kretschmer at the London Cage is worth reading in full because it's the only contemporaneous character assessment we have that wasn't produced by the German military or its propaganda apparatus, and wasn't written retrospectively by biographers working from his authorized account. His political views were less extremely Nazi than had been assumed. On seeing bomb damage near Buckingham Palace, he was genuinely shocked that an attempt had so obviously been made by his countrymen to bomb the palace. He spoke English quite well, though he lacked practice. His whole demeanor was calm and quiet, and he seemed anxious to be friendly. He looked, the report noted, more like a student than a U-boat captain. The interrogator who wrote these lines was a trained professional, assessing a prisoner under controlled conditions for a classified document intended for operational use by senior decision-makers. This wasn't a press release. It was the closest thing to an unmediated portrait of Kretschmer that exists. He told his captors he had become weary of the war. Not broken, weary. There's a difference that the NID officer was careful to preserve in the prose. A broken man doesn't look calm and quiet. A weary man looks exactly like that. He had sunk nearly 250,000 gross register tons of Allied shipping in 18 months, and he'd already stopped finding satisfaction in it before a British sailor had to climb down a rescue net and pull him from the water. He was 28 years old. He was, in the precise language of the interrogation report, done. Here is what a Type 7B submarine attack on a convoy looked like from inside the boat, in the hours between approximately 10:30 at night and 2:30 in the morning of the 18th to 19th of October, 1940. Not as drama, as procedure. U-99 was running on the surface. The diesels were producing approximately 700 brake horsepower each, both engines engaged, combined output around 1,400 brake horsepower, pushing the boat at roughly 7 knots. Below the convoy's standard cruising speed of 6 knots by just enough to achieve a gradual overtake, and slow enough to minimize the white bow wave that Kretschmer's 7th point of submarine warfare specifically warned against. The conning tower extended approximately 4.2 meters above the waterline, enough height for the watch officers to see over the ocean surface, but a profile that against a dark horizon at 400 meters was effectively invisible to the human eye without optical assistance. Kretschmer was on the bridge. Peterson was at the wheel below. The UZO was mounted. The convoy had been positioned, by Kretschmer's deliberate approach, on the bright side of the night sky. The side where scattered cloud and ambient light from the horizon silhouetted the merchant ships against a pale background. U-99 was on the dark side. This was point 6 of his 11 points, executed precisely. From the bridge, the convoy's silhouettes were clear. From the convoy's lookouts, looking outward from the bright side toward the dark horizon, U-99 was invisible. The geometry was simple. Executing it, finding the dark quadrant, maintaining position without submerging, committing to remain on the surface inside an escort screen, was not simple at all. The ASDIC equipment aboard SC-7's escorts was operating in the mode it was designed for. Sound pulses were being sent downward and outward through the water column, searching for the reflection of a submarine hull. The pulses weren't finding one because U-99's hull was not submerged. She was on the surface, running her diesels, producing noise, but that noise was drowned completely by the combined acoustic output of 35 merchant vessels running their own engines, generating their own propeller wash, creating a background field of approximately 130 decibels or more of combined machinery and wave noise. The Type 7B's surface noise signature, in calm water, has been estimated at roughly 85 to 90 decibels at 50 meters. The ocean around SC-7 was, acoustically, a wall of sound behind which U-99 was operating. Kretschmer hadn't invented this. He'd simply been willing to act on it when other commanders weren't. The first torpedo was fired at a target bearing, taken through the UZO. The solution was fed to the TDC. The tube was opened. The G7E electric torpedo was launched. No visible wake because the electric motor left no compressed air trail. At 400 meters range and a speed of 30 knots, the torpedo's transit time was roughly 26 to 27 seconds. The target, a loaded cargo vessel making 6 knots and unable to maneuver quickly because of her position within the convoy formation, had less than half a minute to respond to something it couldn't see coming. The ship was hit. She began to go down. U-99 had already begun its course correction. No diving, no withdrawal, a turn of approximately 25 degrees to port to bring the next bearing into the UZO field. Time between first and second shots, approximately 4 minutes. The second torpedo was fired. This sequence continued for approximately 4 hours. 6 ships sank. A 7th was damaged severely. 14 torpedoes were fired across that period. 13 found their marks. The escort commander's after-action report for SC-7, filed with the Admiralty after the convoy's remnants reached Liverpool, states that no submarine was detected inside the convoy screen during that night. The same night. The two documents, the British after-action report and U-99's war diary, are describing the same stretch of ocean, and they describe different realities, because they were written from different positions within a battle, where one side was seeing and one side was blind. What ended, eventually, the period of ASDIC's blind spot against surface attackers was not a single technical breakthrough, but a cumulative set of responses. The introduction of centimetric radar aboard surface escorts, capable of detecting a surfaced conning tower at significant range, regardless of ambient conditions. Improved convoy routing intelligence from Bletchley Park's work on Enigma traffic. expanded escort groups with better tactical training and coordination, and, eventually, the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap by very long-range aircraft capable of providing air cover across the full convoy route. None of these developments was in place in October of 1940. Most were still months or years away. The window in which Kretschmer's surface attack method was close to unstoppable was open, and he was operating inside it with the most precisely calibrated skill of any commander in the German service. The figures from that single night, 6 ships, 14 torpedoes, 13 hits, approximately 36,000 gross register tons, represent a rate of maritime destruction that has not been matched in a single continuous surface engagement by any submarine commander in any navy since. That isn't hyperbole, and it isn't mythology. It's the arithmetic of what happened on the night of the 18th to 19th of October, 1940, in the North Atlantic, measured against the available historical record. The window closed. The methods became untenable. The record stood. Peterson was at the wheel for all of it. His name appears in one Knight's Cross recommendation, approved the 5th of November, 1940, and almost nowhere else. He steered the boat. He held the course. He made the micro-corrections that kept the approach geometry intact, while his commander watched through the UZO. His specific actions on that night, the moments where his judgment was the only thing between the boat and a betraying bow wave, a wrong angle, a missed bearing, are nowhere in the archive. He was the mechanism behind the method, and the record doesn't contain him. What I find myself returning to, working through the reconstruction of that night, is not the kills. It's the choice to stay on the surface. Every training doctrine, every standard operating procedure, every instinct developed in peacetime submarine exercises said that when you fired your first torpedo inside a convoy screen, you dive. You put water between yourself and the escorts. You use the boat's only reliable defensive asset. Kretschmer's 10th point was explicit. Once an attack is launched, do not submerge except in circumstances of dire necessity. He wrote that principle down before the war. He executed it for 4 hours in the middle of 35 merchant ships and their escorts on a night in October 1940. He stayed on the surface because he'd done the arithmetic and concluded that the surface, counterintuitively, was where the safety was. He wasn't wrong. He was right in a way that the entire Allied anti-submarine apparatus failed to understand until it was too late to do anything about it that night. The convoy SC-7 arrived in Liverpool, what remained of it, 15 ships of the original 35, on approximately the 21st of October, 1940. The Admiralty's monthly anti-submarine report processed the losses, counted the tonnage, noted the failure of the escorts, and filed its assessments for the officers responsible for making the convoy system work. The document that recorded the catastrophe was written in passive voice. Ships were sunk. No submarines were named in that section. The gap between what the document says and what U-99's war diary confirms is, in its own way, a measure of how the happy time worked. The German side knew exactly what it had done. The British side was still trying to understand what had happened to them. On the 16th of March 1941, 3 German submarines were operating against convoy HX-112 in the North Atlantic. One of them was U-99. The convoy had departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, and was making its way eastward toward the British Isles, under escort from a group of destroyers and corvettes commanded by Commander Donald McIntyre aboard HMS Walker. The escort group was experienced. That distinction mattered enormously, because by the spring of 1941, The quality gap between experienced convoy escort commanders and inexperienced ones had become the single most consequential variable in determining whether a convoy survived its Atlantic crossing or didn't. McIntyre's group wasn't rattled. They knew how to work together. They'd developed the coordination that turned a collection of individual vessels into something that functioned as a coherent defensive system. Against this specific escort group, on this specific night, Kretschmer brought the same surface penetration method that had produced 36,000 gross register tons across 4 hours in October. He sank ships. Then things went wrong in a sequence that moved very fast. Before we get to U-99's final hours, it's worth understanding what had already happened to the other 2 German commanders operating in the same area that night, because the 3 losses didn't occur in isolation. They were connected, not by coordination, but by the convergence of multiple German submarines against the same convoy and the same escort group simultaneously. Günther Prien in U-47, the commander of the Scapa Flow attack in October of 1939, possibly the most publicly celebrated U-boat captain in Germany, had already disappeared 10 days earlier, on the 7th of March, during an attack on convoy OB-293. British reports from that engagement mention a deep red glow beneath the surface amid depth charge detonations. There was no survivor. German radio didn't announce his death. The propaganda apparatus had made Prien into something close to a national symbol, and the propaganda ministry calculated that disclosing his loss alongside the losses of Schepke and Kretschmer, all within 10 days of each other, might produce a collapse in civilian morale that would be difficult to manage. He was kept officially alive, in German public communication, for weeks after he was almost certainly gone. Joachim Schepke in U-100 was the second loss on the night of the 16th to 17th of March. U-100 had been detected, not by ASDIC, but by HMS Vanok's experimental Type 286M radar, which could detect a surfaced conning tower above the waterline at a range that ASDIC against a surface target simply couldn't match. This is the crucial technical point about what changed between the happy time of the autumn of 1940 and the spring of 1941. The surface blind spot was closing. Centimetric radar was beginning to appear on convoy escorts, and its geometry was the inverse of ASDIC's limitation. It worked precisely against the target that ASDIC couldn't find, a vessel on the ocean surface. U-100 was driven up by depth charges, and as she surfaced, Vanok rammed her. Schepke was on his bridge when the destroyer's bow came through. He didn't survive. Kretschmer, several miles away and still working against the convoy's merchant ships, didn't know any of this yet. He was watching the UZO. He was firing. What Kretschmer managed against HX-112 before U-99 was caught is documented in the British loss records for the convoy. He sank all but one of the merchant vessels the convoy lost that night. His methods were the same: surface approach, dark side positioning, close range, single torpedo per target. They worked, as they had worked across 16 previous patrols. Then Walker's depth charges found U-99. The sequence of the attack, as reconstructed from both British after-action reports and the survivor accounts of U-99's crew, placed the boat under sustained depth charge attack that drove her to a depth of approximately 213 meters, well beyond the Type 7B's rated operational depth, which was somewhere around 200 meters, depending on the specific structural tolerances of the individual hull. The pressure hull groaned. Fittings failed. Water began entering the conning tower. Control was lost momentarily, the boat going into a dive that the crew couldn't immediately arrest. Then the ballast tanks were blown, and the boat shot upward, surfacing under fire from the British vessels. Kretschmer made several decisions in rapid succession as U-99 surfaced. He ordered the boat scuttled. The seacocks opened, ensuring that U-99 would not be boarded and captured intact, with her cipher equipment, her charts, her operational materials. He directed his crew toward the rescue nets being thrown from Walker's sides. He sent a signal to Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote that reads in translation as 2 destroyers, depth charges, 50,000 tons, Kretschmer. Then he sent a signal to Walker itself, asking for rescue for his men. McIntyre, in his memoir published in 1956 as U-Boat Killer, describes the scene of the crew coming aboard, and describes Kretschmer being pulled from the water by a British sailor who climbed down the nets when the German commander's strength appeared to be failing. The British Naval Intelligence Interrogation Report from April of 1941, which is a contemporaneous document rather than a memoir reconstructed 15 years later, describes Kretschmer's demeanour upon boarding as calm and quiet, with no mention of exhaustion or near unconsciousness. These two accounts don't fully contradict each other. Exhaustion can coexist with composure, but they don't fully align either. And memoir written 15 years after a dramatic event tends to accumulate the drama it felt at the time. 3 of U-99's crew were lost. 40 were recovered. The boat went to the bottom of the North Atlantic. Kretschmer was taken to Lime Street Station in Liverpool for transport to London. His crew, making their way through the Liverpool streets on foot, were met by civilians whose city had been heavily bombed throughout the winter. Liverpool was as connected to the Atlantic War as any city in Britain, its docks central to the entire import supply chain, and several accounts describe missiles being thrown. Kretschmer travelled separately from his men. In London, he was taken to No. 8 Kensington Palace Gardens, the facility known as the London Cage, operated by Military Intelligence 19, and used to hold high-value prisoners for initial interrogation. He was 28 years old, recently promoted to Korvettenkapitän. The promotion was dated the 1st of March 1941, effective 2 weeks before his capture, and he was in the hands of naval intelligence officers who had been waiting a very long time to ask him questions. The British interrogation methodology at the London Cage combined formal questioning with monitored informal settings. Common rooms where prisoners were allowed to talk among themselves without appearing to be observed, while listening devices and intelligence personnel tracked what was said in unguarded moments. The report that emerged from this process, filed in April of 1941 and designated Confidential Book 04051, parenthesis 20, runs to several sections covering not only Kretschmer's tactical methods and U-99's technical specifications, but also the crew's incidental disclosures about other submarines, base facilities, construction programs, and personnel. The prefatory disclaimer is admirably honest. The following report is compiled from information derived from prisoners of war. The statements made cannot always be verified. They should therefore not be accepted as facts unless they are definitely stated to be confirmed by information from other sources. The Admiralty was flagging its own epistemological caution in its own classified document. That kind of intellectual honesty in a wartime intelligence product is worth noticing. Section 7 of the report, the Technical Specifications section, contains data on U-99's diesel engine horsepower, torpedo configuration, depth performance, and targeting equipment. Some of this was volunteered. Some was extracted through indirect questioning. The report doesn't always distinguish between the two. The UZO targeting system received specific attention, its optical characteristics and bearing calibration described in terms that suggest either a crew member with technical knowledge talked more freely than Kretschmer intended, or that the intelligence officers were skilled enough to assemble a coherent technical picture from fragments provided by different crew members who each thought they were revealing less than they were. This was standard NID practice, triangulating partial disclosures from multiple sources until the total exceeded what any individual had consciously provided. The crew of U-99 were not, for the most part, trained in resistance to systematic interrogation of this kind. The report's psychological assessment of Kretschmer himself, the section I quoted in the previous chapter, goes beyond personality observation. It records specific reactions to specific stimuli. The genuine shock on seeing the bomb damage near Buckingham Palace. The apparent friendliness toward British officers, contrasted with greater wariness displayed by his first lieutenant. The assessment that his political views were less extremely Nazi than had been assumed. A phrase that implies the interrogating officers had formed a prior expectation based on his profile and propaganda coverage, and that the man in the room didn't match it. Churchill's announcement in the House of Commons on the 21st of March named him directly. German radio acknowledged the capture, noted Schepke's death, and said nothing about Prien, who was already gone. The three losses, announced in fragmentary sequence over several weeks, were managed as carefully as any propaganda campaign, because that's what the management of military heroism always is, even in defeat. What the technical sections of the NID report produced in terms of operational intelligence, beyond the immediate Kretschmer case, is difficult to assess precisely. But it's worth noting that Section 12's coverage of German submarine construction programs, describing build activity at Hamburg, Bremen, Wilhelmshaven, and Kiel, appears in a form consistent with information that could inform bomber command targeting of shipyard infrastructure. Whether it directly contributed to specific targeting decisions isn't something I can establish from the available sources. What the report makes clear is that it wasn't primarily a character study or a tactical retrospective. It was a working intelligence document intended to support decisions being made in real time about a war that was still going. Kretschmer was transferred to the No. 1 prisoner of war camp at Grisdale Hall in Cumbria shortly after the London interrogation was complete. He arrived as a prisoner. He almost immediately began operating as something else. Grisdale Hall was a large country house in the Lake District, requisitioned for use as an officer prisoner of war camp in the early stages of the war. It held German officers of various ranks and branches of service, and it operated under the Geneva Convention framework that governed the treatment and organization of prisoner populations. One of the provisions of that framework was that prisoners could maintain their own internal military hierarchy. The senior officer of the captive group was recognized as having a degree of authority over his fellow prisoners in matters of internal administration. Otto Kretschmer arrived at Grisdale Hall as the most senior German naval officer in the camp. He assumed the role of senior prisoner officer as a matter of rank. What he did with that role went beyond what the Geneva Convention envisaged, or what British camp administration was prepared to manage. In August of 1941, the German submarine U-570 was captured by a Royal Air Force Hudson Maritime Patrol aircraft in the North Atlantic. The submarine had surfaced in distress, and when the aircraft appeared overhead, its commander, Kapitänleutnant Hans-Joachim Ramlow, surrendered the boat without scuttling it and without destroying the cipher equipment. U-570 was boarded by the British, towed to Iceland, and eventually commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Graf, providing British naval intelligence with an intact Type 7C submarine to examine in exhaustive detail. For the German Navy, the capture of an undamaged submarine was an intelligence disaster of the first order. For the prisoner population at Grisdale Hall, where most of U-570's officers were subsequently sent, it became the occasion for something that has no legitimate name in military law. Kretschmer convened what he called a court of honor, an internal tribunal with no legal standing under any recognized framework, operating entirely within the prisoner population under his authority as senior officer. The tribunal tried Commander Ramlo in absentia. Ramlo himself had been held separately and wasn't present, and reached verdicts on U-570's officers regarding their conduct at the time of the submarine's surrender. 2 officers were found, by this tribunal's own standards, to have acted with cowardice. One of them was Oberleutnant Bernhard Berndt. Following the verdict, Berndt was pressured, by what mechanisms the record doesn't fully specify, but pressure within a closed prisoner population has its own specific character, to escape from the camp and make his way to freedom, thereby demonstrating the courage the tribunal had found him lacking. On the night of the 18th to 19th of October, 1941, the first anniversary, by a coincidence that history offers without editorial comment, of Kretschmer's greatest operational night at SC-7, Berndt escaped over the wire. A detachment of the Home Guard found him in the surrounding countryside. He was 23 years old. He was shot and killed. The tribunal had no legal standing. Kretschmer had no jurisdiction over Ramlo or his officers. They were prisoners of a foreign power, governed by international law, not by the internal disciplinary authority of a captured German naval officer. Berndt's escape and his death were the direct consequence of a verdict rendered by a body that had no right to render it and no authority to enforce it. Allied legal authorities investigated the episode after the war. The question of whether Kretschmer bore criminal responsibility for Berndt's death was examined. He was never prosecuted. The decision not to pursue charges was likely shaped by political considerations. The trial of Germany's most celebrated submarine commander for a camp death in Cumbria would have created its own set of complications in the post-war period, when the priority was reconstruction and the integration of West Germany into the emerging Western Alliance. The absence of prosecution is not the same as the absence of responsibility. And I think it's important to say that plainly, rather than let the silence of the legal record imply an acquittal that never occurred. This wasn't the only instance of extrajudicial authority that Kretschmer exercised as a prisoner. He was subsequently involved in a second court of honor proceeding against Commander Hugo Förster of U-501. The details of that tribunal are less thoroughly documented in the available sources, but the outcome is recorded. Förster was eventually repatriated to Germany, and he committed suicide before the war ended. 2 men are dead whose deaths connect, through the chain of documented events, to Kretschmer's exercise of prisoner authority. The popular biographical treatments of his career either mention the Berndt case briefly or don't mention it at all. It doesn't fit the chivalrous ace framework that formed around his reputation after the war. And frameworks tend to shape what gets included and what gets quietly set aside. In March of 1942, the prisoner population at Grisdale Hall was transferred to Canada, specifically to Camp 30 at Bowmanville, Ontario, on the north shore of Lake Ontario, a facility that would hold Kretschmer for most of the remaining war years. The sea crossing took him back across the Atlantic as a prisoner, across the waters where he had spent 18 months as its most effective predator. No account of his thoughts during that crossing has survived. The documentary record has, in keeping with everything else about him, nothing personal to offer. He arrived in Canada and became, within the prisoner population at Bowmanville, precisely what he had been at Grisdale: the senior officer, the organizer, the operational center of gravity around which prisoner resistance was structured and coordinated. The Battle of Bowmanville in October of 1942 was a 3-day riot within Camp 30, triggered by the Canadian authorities' attempt to shackle 100 senior German officer prisoners in retaliation for the shackling of Canadian prisoners following the Dieppe raid. The German prisoners resisted physically. Camp records indicate that Kretschmer was among the senior officers coordinating prisoner resistance throughout the 3 days. Windows were broken. Guards were fought. The camp commandant negotiated. The shackling was eventually applied in a modified form, then abandoned. It was not the most consequential event of Kretschmer's captivity. That distinction belongs to what came next. But it demonstrated something about the man that the Atlantic record had already suggested. He didn't accept conditions he judged unacceptable, and he organized others to push back against them. Operation Kibitz was the most elaborate escape attempt of Kretschmer's captivity, and by some measures, one of the most operationally sophisticated escape operations of the entire war. It was also a complete failure. The plan required the simultaneous digging of 3 separate tunnel shafts from within Camp 30's buildings, each extending approximately 15 meters toward the wire perimeter. More than 150 prisoners were involved in the excavation effort, working with improvised tools, sharpened eating implements, modified mess tins, and shoring the tunnel walls with planks removed from bunk frames. The excavated soil, approximately 85 cubic meters of it across the 3 shafts, was concealed in the camp's garden plots, under floorboards, and in bags worn inside clothing during outdoor exercise periods. Ventilation for the tunnels was provided by improvised bellows made from cut-up kit bags. The engineering was adequate. It wasn't the engineering that failed. The plan's pickup element required that escapees reach Point Maisonette on Chaleur Bay in New Brunswick, a coastline more than 500 kilometers from Bowmanville, where a German submarine, designated U-536, would be waiting at the prearranged rendezvous point on the 27th of September, 1943. U-536 was a Type 9 C-40 boat, considerably larger than the 7 BU-99, with a range adequate for the North Atlantic crossing required by the rescue mission. The fact that the German Navy was willing to expose an operational submarine to the shallow inshore waters of a Canadian bay, with the detection risks that implied, to recover Kretschmer specifically says something about how the Kriegsmarine valued what his return to operational command might contribute. Korvettenkapitän Wolfgang Haider was the one man who actually made it over the wire. He was recaptured above ground before he came within reach of the coast. The submarine waited. No one came. U-536 withdrew. The tunnel operation's failure wasn't structural. The tunnels themselves were apparently functional. The concealment of the spoil had held throughout months of digging, and the coordination of 150 prisoners in a covert operation under the noses of camp guards represented a genuine organizational achievement. The failure was at the surface, the exposed, trackless grounds between the camp perimeter and the Canadian coast that was hundreds of kilometers away, where a single escaped prisoner moving through unfamiliar territory in a country that wasn't at war on its own soil had effectively nowhere to disappear into. Kretschmer had solved the engineering problem. He hadn't solved the geography. He remained at Bowmanville until December of 1947, promoted twice more in absentia by a navy that was keeping his rank current even as it was being destroyed around him. Vergattenkapitän on the 1st of September 1944, while he was still in Canada, still behind wire, still planning and coordinating and running the prisoner hierarchy with the same systematic instinct that had governed everything else he'd done. He was released on the 31st of December 1947, New Year's Eve. He was 35 years old and had spent more than 6 years as a prisoner of war. He returned to a Germany divided, ruined, and stripped of the navy he'd served. His first act on German soil is not recorded in any source I have found. On the 26th of December, 1941, Christmas Day in the Orthodox calendar, the day after Christmas in the Western one, a name was entered into the Wehrmacht's decoration register in Berlin. The entry read, Korvettenkapitän Kretschmer, O. Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords, 5th recipient. He was the 5th person in the entire armed forces of the Third Reich to receive this decoration. Before him, Werner Mulders, the fighter pilot ace, who had in fact died in a plane crash in November and therefore received his award posthumously. Adolf Galland, the fighter commander. Erwin Rommel, then commanding in North Africa. Hans Ulrich Hudel, the Stuka pilot. And now Kretschmer, the sole naval officer in this initial cohort, and the only one who was, at the moment of award, sitting in a British prisoner of war camp in Cumbria. The physical object itself was handcrafted by the Berlin decorating firm of Godet. Individual pieces, not mass-produced. The cross itself of silver and gold with the oak leaf and sword details worked by hand. Each one was unique in minor particulars of finish. The decoration was mailed to Kretschmer through the International Red Cross's postal service for prisoners of war. He received Germany's highest military honor through a humanitarian postal service. I keep returning to that sentence because it contains, in compressed form, the entire absurdity of the institutional relationship between the Third Reich and the man it was honoring. The regime needed him as a symbol. He was in a building in Cumbria that the regime had no access to, so the symbol was mailed. German radio announced the award in the final days of December 1941. The announcement was carefully constructed. It named the decoration, named the recipient, described his operational achievements, the tonnage record, the patrol record, the Atlantic campaign, and managed to do all of this without explicitly reminding German listeners that the recipient was currently a prisoner in Britain. The passive architecture of the announcement did the necessary work. Kretschmer was honored, his achievement was celebrated, the regime's investment in his mythology was protected, and the awkward fact of his captivity was present by omission rather than statement. German propaganda had learned over 2 years of managing public information about the war at sea that what you didn't say could be managed as carefully as what you did. By December of 1941, when Kretschmer received his decoration, the Battle of the Atlantic had already shifted in ways that his achievement had anticipated, but that the ceremony was careful not to acknowledge. Monthly shipping losses for December of that year were approximately 124,000 gross register tons, dramatically below the 600,000 that Dönitz's strategic memorandum had identified as the minimum necessary to make the tonnage war work. The fleet that Kretschmer had been the most effective individual component of was not achieving its strategic objective. The American entry into the war following December of 1941 would, within months, temporarily reverse this. The U-boats achieving enormous success against unprepared coastal shipping along the American eastern seaboard. The second happy time that historians sometimes call Operation Drumbeat. But that was a different kind of success from a different tactical situation, and it produced results that didn't translate into the sustained strategic attrition Dönitz needed. The parallel promotions, Korvettenkapitän effective the 1st of March 1941, awarded while he was a prisoner, Fregattenkapitän on the 1st of September 1944, also while a prisoner, are a peculiar institutional footnote to the main event of his captivity. The German Navy was keeping his seniority alive. His rank advanced according to the normal schedule of promotion, while his world contracted to the 40 acres of Camp 30. When he eventually returned to Germany in 1947, he held the rank of a senior commander in a navy that no longer existed. He wore a rank that had been earned in captivity toward a service that had been dissolved in defeat. The post-war West German Bundesmarine, when it was eventually established in 1955, would accept his rank as the starting point for his re-entry into uniform. But that's a later story, and getting there required more than the war's end. What the prisoner population at Camp 30 thought of the Swords Award is not systematically documented. It's recorded that the German prisoners celebrated the announcement, and that British camp staff permitted this within the bounds of what was manageable. An interesting micro-political decision that reflects the ambiguous reality of running a camp that held a foreign military hierarchy intact within a British administrative structure. Kretschmer, as senior prisoner officer, was a known quantity. His men respected his authority. The camp authorities found it more practical to work with that authority structure than against it, up to the point where the illegal tribunals and the escape operations made the working relationship untenable. The decoration ceremony, such as it was, a package arriving through the Red Cross post, was within the category of manageable. The reaction within Germany to the award, and to the carefully managed announcement of Kretschmer's captivity that had preceded it by 9 months, is worth examining briefly because it illustrates how the propaganda apparatus handled the conversion of a living operational hero into a captured one. The narrative that formed in German public culture around Kretschmer during his captivity wasn't one of defeat. It was closer to one of martyrdom in the non-religious sense. The supreme champion, taken from the field at the height of his powers, his record intact, his honor uncompromised. The German Navy's handling of the announcement had helped construct this frame. Kretschmer surfaced under fire, sent his crew to safety before himself, was pulled from the water by his enemy. He was captured rather than killed. He remained alive, somewhere across the Atlantic, holding the tonnage record. The award of the highest military decoration to a prisoner reinforced the frame rather than undermining it. Germany honors its best even when it cannot reach them. What this framing required, and what it systematically obscured, was the operational reality it was built on. The 3 aces lost in 10 days, Prien, Schepke, Kretschmer, represented not just 3 individual losses, but the visible peak of a shift in British anti-submarine competence that had been building since late 1940. The centimetric radar that found Schepke, the experienced escort group that found Kretschmer, the improved depth charge tactics, the beginning of better convoy routing intelligence from Bletchley Park's partial penetration of German naval Enigma traffic. None of these developments appeared in the German propaganda account of March 1941. They couldn't, because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging that the battle was turning in ways that individual heroism couldn't reverse. The mythology of the aces served a specific institutional function. It converted strategic deterioration into personal narrative, making the audience feel that the war at sea was a story of individuals rather than a story of industrial and technological competition. It was, of course, both. But the industrial and technological competition was the one Germany was beginning to lose. Kretschmer's decoration in absentia was therefore not simply a recognition of individual achievement, though it was that. It was also an institutional act of narrative management, the regime using its highest available honor to tell a story about the war that was more sustaining than the actual statistics of the campaign would have permitted. He was the record holder. He was being honored at the record's peak. The fact that the record had been set in conditions that were already changing when he was captured, and that the fleet he'd been part of was about to enter its most difficult years, was not part of the announcement. Propaganda, as a practice, works by selecting which truths to emphasize. The swords were a real decoration for a real achievement. They were also a carefully timed piece of information management. The decoration sits in the record now as an object, physical, specific, documented, in a way that a lot of what happened to Kretschmer during his captivity doesn't. The illegal tribunals are documented but contested. The escape operation is documented but incomplete. The promotions are recorded in administrative registers. The awards announcement is preserved in press records. What Kretschmer himself made of the decoration, what he felt when the Red Cross package arrived, where he put it in the barracks room that was his world in late 1941, none of this is in the archive. The record has the object and the announcement. The man who received it left nothing behind that tells us what it meant to him. In a memorandum that Dönitz had circulated within the Oberkommando der Marine before the war reached its full intensity, he set out the arithmetic that would govern the entire German naval campaign. Destroy between 600,000 and 700,000 gross register tons of Allied shipping per month, he argued. and Britain's ability to replace its losses through new construction would be exceeded. Sustain that rate long enough, and the supply flow through British ports would begin to fail. The reasoning was coherent within its own terms. The problem was that it required things Dönitz never had: enough submarines operational in the Atlantic at any given moment, enough trained crews to man them, enough months without the Allies developing countermeasures adequate to reduce the sinking rate below the replacement threshold. By the time I've done the arithmetic myself, working through the monthly figures from 1940 to 1943, what's striking isn't how close Germany came to making the tonnage war work. It's how specific the window was in which it might have worked at all, and how quickly that window closed. The peak month of Allied shipping losses in the entire Battle of the Atlantic was November of 1942. In that single month, the U-boat arm destroyed approximately 860,000 gross register tons of merchant shipping, approaching, for the first time, the threshold that Dönitz's pre-war memorandum had identified as strategically decisive. That peak arrived 18 months after Kretschmer's capture. His career had coincided not with the crisis point of the tonnage war, but with its build-up phase, the period when the arithmetic was moving in the right direction but hadn't yet arrived. And by the time it arrived, the other side of the equation had changed in ways that made the peak unsustainable almost as soon as it was reached. The Liberty ship program is the counterweight to everything the U-boat arm achieved, and it doesn't get enough attention in most accounts of the Atlantic campaign because it's less dramatically compelling than submarine warfare. The EC2 SC1 type, the standard Liberty ship design, was an evolution of a British cargo vessel blueprint that American yards had adapted for mass production. The innovation was prefabrication. Sections of the ship were built in inland factories, away from the coastal shipyards, and then assembled at the water's edge. This removed the bottleneck of all skilled work having to happen in one place, and compressed construction timelines dramatically. In 1941, an average Liberty ship took approximately 230 days to build, from keel laying to delivery. By 1943, the average had fallen to 42 days. The fastest single construction record was a ship called the SS Robert E. Peary, completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes in November of 1942. A demonstration build staged specifically to show what the production system could do when pushed to its absolute limit. Kretschmer, across his entire operational career, sank approximately 19 Liberty ship equivalents in gross register tonnage terms. The United States was building that many in approximately 3 weeks at peak output. Dönitz knew, privately, that his resources were insufficient for the task his strategy required. His own war diary, the KTB, contains entries from throughout the campaign in which he records the gap between the number of submarines he needed in the Atlantic and the number he actually had operational. At the time of Kretschmer's capture in March of 1941, Dönitz had approximately 22 U-boats operationally deployed in the Atlantic. His own calculations suggested he needed a minimum of 100 to maintain the sinking rate his strategic arithmetic required. He was operating at roughly 22% of the force level his own doctrine demanded. He continued to present optimistic assessments to Hitler. The gap between what Dönitz privately recorded and what he officially reported upward in the chain of command is one of the more instructive examples in the entire war of how authoritarian command structures create institutional pressure toward the suppression of inconvenient mathematics. The German shipbuilding and production situation compounded this problem in ways that were structural rather than circumstantial. Steel allocation within the German war economy was a constant competition between programs: submarines, surface ships, tanks, aircraft, artillery, the infrastructure of occupation across an enormous conquered territory. Albert Speer, when he took over armaments production in February of 1942, found a system in which competing priorities had produced systematic underperformance across most major programs. The submarine program had, before Speer's rationalization efforts, been producing fewer boats per month than the technical capacity of the yard suggested was possible, partly because of steel shortfalls, partly because of labour competition with other programs, and partly because Hitler's personal strategic preferences repeatedly tilted resources towards surface fleet projects, most notably the battleships, that consumed enormous quantities of material and produced minimal operational return in the Atlantic campaign. The tonnage war was being fought with less than the minimum necessary force, because the industrial and political leadership of the Third Reich had not made it the unambiguous first priority it would have needed to be. The British side of the equation is sometimes discussed primarily in terms of Bletchley Park and Enigma, the decryption of German naval communications that eventually gave convoy routing officers advance warning of U-boat positions and allowed convoys to be diverted around concentrations of submarines. The Enigma story is real and important, but it's worth being precise about its timeline, because the common assumption that the British were reading German naval traffic throughout the Battle of the Atlantic is not accurate. Naval Enigma, the specific variant used by the U-boat arm, was significantly harder to penetrate than the Luftwaffe and Army versions, and the decryption program at Bletchley had major gaps and periods of blackout throughout the critical years of the campaign. The partial penetration that began to be operationally useful in the spring and early summer of 1941 came too late to affect Kretschmer's career, but contributed significantly to the convoy routing improvements that reduced U-boat effectiveness through the middle period of the war. The capture of U-110 in May of 1941, shortly after Kretschmer's own capture, and the seizure of her Enigma materials contributed directly to this work. The air gap was the other structural constraint on Allied convoy defence, and it's the one that gets less attention than it deserves. The mid-Atlantic, roughly between the western range of aircraft operating from Iceland and the British Isles, and the eastern range of aircraft operating from Canada and Newfoundland, was a zone of approximately 600 nautical miles in width, where convoy protection from the air was simply unavailable throughout most of the campaign's critical period. U-boats operating in the air gap could surface in daylight with relative impunity, hunt convoys, and dive at will when aircraft appeared at the edges of the coverage zone. The closure of this gap, eventually achieved through the deployment of very long-range consolidated B-24 Liberator aircraft from both sides of the Atlantic, was one of the decisive developments of the campaign, but it didn't happen until 1943. For the period that includes everything Kretschmer ever did, the air gap was open. What the tonnage war actually demonstrated, when you work through the arithmetic of the entire campaign, rather than its most dramatic individual episodes, is something more modest and more instructive than the dramatic narrative usually suggests. It demonstrated that a submarine campaign, even one of exceptional quality and operational ingenuity, cannot substitute for the industrial superiority and logistical depth that determines which side wins a sustained material attrition war. The U-boat arm at its peak, roughly the spring of 1943, before the catastrophic losses of Black May, had approximately 240 submarines in commission, with perhaps half that number operational in the Atlantic at any given time. Against this force, the Allies deployed an expanding network of convoy escorts, patrol aircraft, escort carriers, hunter-killer groups, and land-based maritime patrol bombers, backed by a shipbuilding program that was generating replacement tonnage faster than the U-boats could sink it. The arithmetic, once American industry was fully engaged, only moved in one direction. Kretschmer's tonnage record sits within this strategic context as something between an extraordinary individual achievement and a very large number that the industrial context rendered strategically insufficient. 274,000 gross register tons across 18 months represents, against the Liberty ship production numbers, approximately 19.5 ships at peak American output, less than 3 weeks of replacement production. Against the total Allied shipping losses of the entire Battle of the Atlantic, approximately 13.5 million gross register tons over 6 years, his contribution is roughly 2%. I don't offer these figures to diminish what he did. I offer them because understanding what the record meant strategically requires holding both the individual scale and the industrial scale in mind simultaneously, and most popular accounts only offer one or the other. Dönitz's 300 submarine counterfactual, his post-war claim that with sufficient force he could have won the Tonnage War, has been debated among naval historians for decades. Mark Milner, among others, has challenged it on the grounds that it assumes Allied convoy doctrine, escort technology, and code-breaking capabilities would not have adapted in response to a dramatically larger U-boat threat, which is an assumption that the historical evidence about Allied adaptability throughout the campaign makes difficult to sustain. The counterfactual also requires Germany to have built and manned 300 operational submarines, which would have required steel and labour allocations that, within the constraints of the German war economy as it actually existed, would have come at the expense of other programs. The arithmetic of what if Dönitz had 300 submarines is inseparable from the arithmetic of what wouldn't Germany have built instead. And that second question tends not to appear in Dönitz's version of the argument. The Tonnage War was, in the end, a strategic concept that made logical sense against a specific set of assumptions about British-American industrial capacity, convoy system resilience, and the rate at which Allied countermeasures would develop. And that turned out to be wrong about most of those assumptions, in ways that became clear only gradually, and too late for the strategy to be abandoned and replaced with something more viable. Kretschmer was the finest instrument of a flawed strategy, operating in its most favourable conditions, during its most productive period. That's not a small thing. But it's also not the same as winning. There is a document, the British Naval Intelligence Division's interrogation report on U-99, compiled in April of 1941, classification Confidential Book 04051, that begins with a remarkable admission for a wartime intelligence document. It says, on its opening substantive page, that the statements made cannot always be verified. They should therefore not be accepted as facts, unless they are definitely stated to be confirmed by information from other sources. I keep returning to that sentence. It's the Admiralty flagging, in its own classified product, the epistemological limitations of prisoner testimony as a source of reliable intelligence. It's telling its own readers to be careful with what follows. In a documentary that is itself an extended exercise in evaluating sources against each other, that kind of institutional self-awareness feels like a kindred spirit across 85 years. The document covers Kretschmer's career in summary, U-99's technical specifications in detail, the crew's incidental disclosures about other submarines and bases, and, in the section that interests me most, a psychological portrait of the man himself that no other contemporaneous source provides. The portrait was drawn by trained intelligence officers whose professional obligation was accuracy, whose audience was senior decision-makers who needed reliable assessments, and whose document was classified at a level that removed any motive for flattery or distortion. It wasn't written for public consumption. It was written to be useful. That context makes it the most trustworthy single characterization of Kretschmer that the archive contains. The portrait that emerges is of a man who didn't match the image his own regime had built around him. He looked, the report notes, more like a student than a U-boat captain. He was calm. He was quiet. He was anxious to be friendly toward his British captors in a way that his first lieutenant, more guarded and more suspicious, was not. His political views were assessed as less extremely aligned with the dominant ideology than expected, and he told his interrogators, in a statement that the report treats as genuine rather than strategically managed, that he had become weary of the war some time ago and latterly had got no satisfaction from sinking ship after ship. He said this while still, technically, an active commander. He'd been promoted 2 weeks before his capture. He was in British hands within days of assuming his new rank. The weariness he described wasn't the exhaustion of a man who'd been broken by captivity. It was something he had already been carrying when U-99 surfaced under fire, and he began directing his crew toward the rescue nets. The London cage at number 8 Kensington Palace Gardens operated under Colonel A.P. Scotland of Military Intelligence 19, and it used a combination of formal interrogation sessions and monitored informal environments. Rooms where prisoners believed they were unobserved, where listening devices and intelligence personnel tracked conversations that captives allowed themselves to have under the assumption of privacy. Kretschmer's formal sessions produced the tactical and technical material in the report's later sections. The psychological assessment reads more like the product of extended observation, watching how he behaved in the spaces between formal questioning, how he held himself, what he reacted to, what he didn't react to. The bomb damage near Buckingham Palace was apparently visible from somewhere accessible to the prisoners during their time in London. The report records his genuine shock on seeing it, not performed outrage, not calculated sympathy, but something the trained observer read as authentic surprise that German bombs had been aimed at a building of that specific symbolic weight. He'd spent a year at a British university in his late teens. He had, as the biographical record suggests, a respect for British institutions that his military service against Britain hadn't entirely extinguished. His crew talked more than he did. The technical sections of the report, Section 7's detailed specifications of U-99 systems, Section 9's catalogue of information about other submarines, Section 11's descriptions of base facilities at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, Wilhelmshaven, all carry the caveat that the information comes from crew members whose statements couldn't always be cross-verified. The interrogation methodology triangulated between them, assembling from fragments provided by multiple sources a composite picture that exceeded what any individual crew member had consciously offered. This is standard intelligence tradecraft, and the NID was skilled at it. Kretschmer himself appears to have offered relatively little in the formal sessions. The psychological portrait may actually be the more valuable product of the London interrogation, precisely because it wasn't something that could be withheld. Churchill announced Kretschmer's capture to the House of Commons on the 21st of March, 1941. It was treated as a significant morale event rather than a routine prisoner notification, because the British government understood that the tonnage record was publicly known in Germany. Kretschmer's name had appeared in German press coverage, his awards had been announced, and that his capture therefore carried symbolic weight that the capture of an ordinary prisoner of war did not. German radio's acknowledgement of the capture was, from the German side, an exercise in managing the same symbolic weight in reverse, confirming what the British had announced while framing it in terms that preserved the heroic narrative. The announcement of Schepke's death came with it. Preen's death, which had occurred 10 days earlier, did not. The 3 losses, in German public communication, were released on a schedule designed to minimize their collective emotional impact. Preen was quietly mourned in government circles for weeks before his death was confirmed for the public. The intelligence value of what the London interrogation produced beyond the immediate portrait of Kretschmer was diffuse but real. The information about construction programs at Hamburg and Kiel, Section 12 of the CB 04051 report, appears in a form that would have been useful to operational planning for Bomber Command's ongoing campaign against German industrial infrastructure. Whether it directly informed specific targeting decisions is not something the available sources confirm with precision. What the report makes clear is that the NID wasn't running a biographical exercise when it processed Kretschmer and his crew. It was extracting everything operationally useful from the most experienced U-boat commander yet captured, and organizing that material for distribution to the people making decisions about a war that was still going. The portrait of the man himself was almost a byproduct. the most humanly interesting part of a document designed for entirely practical purposes. When I read through the full text of the CB04051 report, what strikes me most consistently is the gap between the subject it describes and the subject that the German propaganda machine had created. The propaganda Kretschmer was loud, victorious, emblematic, a symbol of German naval power at its most effective. The document's Kretschmer was quiet, tired, genuinely friendly toward his captors, surprised by bomb damage near a palace, and already disengaged from the war he'd been fighting with such precision. Both versions were true simultaneously, in different registers. The propaganda image was built from real actions and real records, not fabricated. The private exhaustion was genuine, attested by a document with no motive to invent it. He was all of these things at once, and the archive holds the contradiction without resolving it, because that's what the archive does. It keeps the evidence. It doesn't write the verdict. What happened next was simple in outline and complex in consequence. He was transferred from London, briefly held at Grisdale Hall in Cumbria, and eventually sent to Canada. The man who had nearly cut Britain's Atlantic lifeline was going to spend the rest of the war in a country that was building the ships he'd spent 18 months trying to sink. There is a Board of Trade Wreck Commissioner's inquiry report, the kind of document that gets filed in maritime archives and rarely opened again, for the cargo vessel Tibetan, sunk in the Moray Firth on the 19th of February, 1940. The entry is functional, the language designed for administrative precision rather than human recognition. Crew aboard, 33. Crew rescued, 0. The official terminology for this outcome is total loss of life. 3 words. The arithmetic is complete. The document closes. What the inquiry report doesn't contain, what no inquiry report of this type can contain, is any account of the 33 individual people whose lives ended in the Moray Firth that morning, or what they were doing on a cargo vessel in the North Sea in February of the second year of the war, or who was waiting for them somewhere that they never came back to. The report exists to establish maritime fact. It establishes it precisely, and in the precision, something is completely absent. I want to spend this chapter with the part of Kretschmer's record that the biographical literature tends to handle with the least sustained attention. Not because the authors are dishonest, but because the chivalrous ace framework that formed around his reputation after the war creates a gravitational pull towards certain documented episodes and away from others. The framework isn't invented. There are genuine episodes of documented compassion in the U-99 record. He did order the boat to backtrack across already hunted water to find a single survivor on a raft. He did give survivors brandy and directions to Ireland. He did wait for crews to abandon ship before firing in specific documented instances. These actions are in the record, and the record supports them. What's also in the record, in the same documents, filed by the same administrative machinery. 33 dead on the Tibetan, no survivors. 15 dead on the Norwegian Varald, January of 1940, no survivors. 157 of 162 dead on HMS Daring, February of 1940. The accounting doesn't cancel. Both columns are real. The Varald sinking requires specific attention because it sits in uncomfortable relation to Kretschmer's own written doctrine. The Norwegian coastal freighter was 1,085 gross register tons, sailing in the waters east of the Shetland Islands in January of 1940. She was a neutral vessel. Norway had not yet been drawn into the war, which would come for her in April of that year. She was sunk without warning. All 15 crew members died. Kretschmer's own point 4 of his 11 points of submarine warfare states that survivors should be assisted when possible. His point 3 states that lone ships should be attacked with gunfire in order to save expensive torpedoes. which also, as a secondary effect, would have given the crew time to abandon ship before the vessel went down. The Virilde was a lone ship. She was sunk with a single torpedo, at night, without warning, with no survivors. The gap between the written doctrine and the documented action is not a small one, and I don't think it can be explained away by operational urgency or tactical necessity alone. The Scotia case in December of 1939 is the other episode that the framework of legitimate targeting strains to accommodate cleanly. She was a Danish vessel, neutral, civilian, sailing in waters off the Orkney Islands at night with her navigation lights extinguished. Kretschmer's justification, recorded in the war diary, was that her darkened state aroused his suspicions, that a vessel running without lights in wartime waters could plausibly be carrying military cargo or operating in support of British naval operations. This reasoning had some basis in the legal framework of submarine warfare as it was understood in 1939. The prize rules and established conventions of armed conflict at sea permitted targeting vessels that displayed outward signs of military connection. Whether a switched-off navigation light in the Orkneys met that threshold is a question that naval legal historians have not answered unanimously. 19 men died on the Scotia. 2 were saved. The legal ambiguity doesn't bring the 19 back. The pattern of the Tibetan, the Virilde, and the Scotia sits alongside the pattern of the rescued survivor in the raft, the brandy and directions after sinking Magog, the waiting for crews to evacuate before firing in specific documented cases, and what the whole pattern reveals, when you don't select from it, is something more complicated and more human than either a chivalric portrait or a prosecutorial indictment. He was consistent in his methods, in the sense that the methods always served the mission. When waiting for a crew to evacuate before firing produced a cleaner shot and conserved torpedoes, he waited. When attacking without warning at night at close range produced the maximum probability of a clean kill, he did that. The compassion was real in the instances where it appeared. It wasn't a governing principle that he applied uniformly, and his own doctrine, read carefully, doesn't quite claim that it was. When possible, is doing a great deal of work in point 4. The sinking of the armed merchant cruiser HMS Patroclus in November of 1940 illustrates the complexity of the operational reality in a different way. The ship had been loaded with wooden barrels in her lower spaces as a deliberate British countermeasure to increase buoyancy and resist torpedo damage. She took torpedo hits and remained afloat. Kretschmer attempted to finish her with the deck gun. She returned fire. He was forced to submerge. He attacked again with torpedoes from below. The total expenditure to sink this single vessel, 9 torpedoes and a dud, according to the war diary, was extraordinary by his usual standards, and the frustration is implicit in the documentary record, even if it isn't stated in terms of emotion. 56 of Patroclus's crew died. 230 survived. The barrel ballasting worked, in the sense that it made the vessel much harder to kill, and thereby likely saved survivors who might otherwise have gone down with a quicker sinking. The British countermeasure and the German method collided that night in the North Atlantic in a way that left real people on both sides of the outcome. The survivors are part of the record too. The Forfar case, the third armed merchant cruiser, sunk in December of 1940, produced an entry in Kretschmer's war diary that is worth examining for what it reveals about the limits of what a commander can know about the effects of his actions. The diary records that after the attack, Kretschmer assumed most of the crew went down with the ship. The British Naval Inquiry and subsequent records, cross-referenced in Morgan and Taylor's study of the armed merchant cruisers, confirmed 159 survivors alongside 176 dead. He assumed a total or near-total loss of life. The actual outcome was that more than half the crew survived. The gap between what he perceived and what actually happened is significant not as a moral accounting, but as evidence of the epistemological conditions of submarine warfare. A commander who fires a torpedo and then moves on has, by the nature of the situation, no reliable way of knowing what his action produced. The war diary is what he believed. The Board of Trade inquiry is what happened. They're different documents about the same night. The G7E torpedo, the electric variant that Kretschmer predominantly used, carried a warhead of approximately 130 kilograms of high explosive. At detonation, that charge generated an overpressure wave capable of rupturing steel plate within approximately 15 meters of the contact point, and a shock wave transmitted through the water that could cause structural damage and injury at considerably greater ranges. A vessel struck amidships by this weapon could have its keel fractured within minutes. The physical process is not abstract. It's a specific mechanical event with specific consequences for the people in the affected sections of the ship. Crew members in those sections had, in many documented cases, a survival window measured in seconds rather than minutes. The G7E left no visible wake, arriving without warning at its 30-knot transit speed. At Kretschmer's preferred engagement ranges of under 500 meters, the travel time was under 30 seconds. The mechanism is precise. Its effects on human beings were not. I've spent more time with the merchant marine survivor testimonies than with most other parts of this archive, because they're the documents that sit most uncomfortably alongside the tactical and strategic analysis that dominates the Kretschmer literature. The survivor testimonies, filed as Board of Trade statements, incorporated into Admiralty loss assessments, occasionally preserved in the records of the Merchant Navy associations, describe the same events that appear in Kretschmer's war diary from an entirely different position. They describe the water temperature, which in the North Atlantic in February runs at approximately 4 degrees Celsius, survivable for perhaps 15 to 30 minutes without protection, depending on the individual. They describe the darkness. They describe the sounds that ships make when they're going down. None of this is in the war diary, because the war diary wasn't written to record it. The two documents were made by people who were in the same water, on the same night, experiencing completely different aspects of the same event. Heinrich Petersen, the helmsman who served on every war patrol of both U-23 and U-99, steered the boat through all of it. The Knight's Cross recommendation that Kretschmer filed for him in November of 1940 cited his role in saving U-99 from enemy detection across 12 patrols. The recommendation was approved. His name appears in the decoration register and in Kretschmer's recommendation text, and essentially nowhere else in the record. He was not interviewed, as far as the available sources indicate, by any post-war historian working on the Kretschmer biography. He fired no torpedoes and gave no orders. He steered the boat on the bearing his commander gave him, night after night, patrol after patrol, from the North Sea to the Atlantic and back to Lorient. What he made of all of it, what the helmsman thought below decks while Kretschmer was watching through the UZO, is nowhere in the archive. The most consistently present person in Kretschmer's entire operational career left the least trace of all. The tonnage record, when you hold it against the full weight of the Board of Trade inquiries, the survivor testimonies, the lists of crew aboard and crew rescued, is both exactly what it appears to be and something considerably more complicated. 274,000 gross register tons is a number that measures cargo capacity. It doesn't measure the 33 dead on the Tibetan, or the 15 dead on the Varald, or the 157 dead on HMS Daring. Those are different numbers, kept in different registers, and they add up to a human cost that the tonnage record doesn't contain. The documentary form demands we work with the numbers we have. The honest historian's obligation is to say clearly what those numbers measure and what they don't. On the 31st of December, 1947, Otto Kretschmer was released from Camp 30 at Bowmanville, Ontario. He'd been a prisoner of war for 6 years, 9 months, and 15 days. The date was New Year's Eve. He returned to a Germany that had been divided by occupation into zones administered by 4 separate Allied powers, its cities heavily damaged, its economy in collapse, its armed forces dissolved by the terms of unconditional surrender, its navy, the service to which he had given his professional life since 1930, simply gone. He was 35 years old. He had spent his entire peak professional decade as a prisoner on the north shore of Lake Ontario. The record of what he did on returning to Germany, his first weeks, his first conversations, his first confrontation with what the country he'd left in 1941 had become by the time he returned to it, is not in any source I have found. The silence, again, is what the archive offers. He married in 1948. Her name was Erika Mühlenbruch. The marriage lasted 50 years. They had children. They eventually settled in Bavaria. The personal chapter of his life, the chapter that runs from December of 1947 to August of 1955, when he rejoined the military in the newly established West German Bundesmarine, is the least documented portion of his entire biography. In a biography that is already notable for the thinness of its personal documentation throughout. He cooperated during this period with Terence Robertson, the journalist and author who was assembling the first major biographical account of his wartime career. Robertson's book, published as The Golden Horseshoe in 1955, was the primary source from which almost all subsequent popular accounts derived their material. Kretschmer corrected Robertson's factual errors, provided his recollections of operational events, and shaped, in the process, the framework within which his career would be understood for the next several decades. He didn't write his own book. He helped someone else write one about him. The control was quieter and more durable for it. The establishment of the Bundesmarine in the autumn of 1955 was the product of a specific Cold War calculation. West Germany's integration into the NATO alliance, formalized by the Paris Agreements of October 1954, required the creation of a West German military contribution to NATO's conventional deterrent against the Soviet Union. The Navy, the Bundesmarine, was one component of this. It needed experienced officers. The experienced officers available in West Germany in 1955 were, almost without exception, men who had served in the Kriegsmarine. The decision to build the new service from this pool of personnel was made explicitly and practically, and it required a framework for evaluating which wartime officers were suitable for reintegration and which were not. The framework that was applied was essentially the Nuremberg Standard. Officers who had committed provable war crimes were excluded. Officers whose wartime service, however effective for the Third Reich, had not produced documented criminal prosecutions were eligible. Kretschmer was eligible. On the 1st of December 1955, he reported for duty in the Bundesmarine at the rank of Fregattenkapitän, the same rank he'd held as a prisoner in 1944. The institutional continuity was deliberate. The West German military took the position that professional rank earned in the Wehrmacht was transferable to the new service as a point of entry, establishing a continuity of professional identity that the founding officers of the Bundesmarine needed to function with authority. He was 43 years old, returning to uniform after an 8-year gap that included a world war, unconditional surrender, and the complete dissolution of the organization he'd previously served. And in 1955, in the same year he rejoined the military, Donald McIntyre returned his binoculars. McIntyre had kept them since the night of the 16th to 17th of March, 1941, when they'd come off the sinking U-99 and into British hands. 14 years. They'd sat in his possession through the end of the war, through the post-war years, through the beginning of the Cold War, through the rearmament debates and the creation of NATO. When he returned them, Kretschmer was serving as president of the Deutsche Marinebund, a member organization of the International Maritime Confederation. McIntyre was the commanding officer of the destroyer that had sunk U-99 and captured its commander. They met, apparently, as professional equals in the peacetime framework of a Western alliance that had been built partly on the premise of German rehabilitation and Franco-British-German cooperation. The binoculars went back to the man they'd belonged to. What either of them said during that meeting is not in any source I have been able to find. His career in the Bundesmarine moved through a series of increasingly senior appointments, with a progression that suggests he was valued by the new service, rather than merely accommodated within it. Command of the 1st Escort Squadron, the Geleitgeschwader, from January to October of 1957. The man who had hunted convoys, now commanding convoy escorts. Service as Admiralstabsoffizier with the Fleet Command. Command of the Bundesmarine's amphibious forces from November of 1958 to January of 1962. Appointment to the NATO Defense College in Paris in August of 1963. His promotion to Capitaine sur See, Captain at Sea, Full Captain, in December of 1958. His promotion to Konteradmiral, Rear Admiral, in June of 1965, confirmed in December of that year. And finally, from June of 1965 to March of 1969, his posting as Chief of Staff of the NATO Command Komnav at Kiel, the command responsible for coordinating Allied naval operations in the Baltic approaches, one of the most strategically sensitive maritime theatres of the Cold War. The geometry of this posting is worth sitting with for a moment. The Baltic approaches, the Kattegat, the Skagerrak, the Danish Straits, were in the 1960s considered one of the likely routes through which Soviet surface and submarine forces might attempt to break out into the North Sea and the Atlantic in the event of a general conflict. The NATO command at Kiel was responsible for planning and coordinating the defense against precisely this scenario. The officer serving as its chief of staff was a man who had spent 18 months perfecting the method of maritime interdiction in the North Atlantic, who understood submarine warfare from the inside, and who had spent 2 years at the NATO Defense College studying the strategic framework of the alliance he was now helping to defend. The institutional logic of the posting was clear enough. Whether the Soviet Navy, whose own submarine doctrine had evolved considerably since 1941, presented a threat that Kretschmer's experience was directly applicable to, is a separate question. The Cold War submarine was a nuclear-powered beast with endurance measured in months rather than days, operating in a global strategic context that the Type 7B's 5 torpedoes and North Atlantic hunting ground had no direct analogy with. His knowledge was foundational rather than current, but foundational knowledge of how submarines think, how their commanders weigh risk against concealment, how they use geometry and patience and the specific limitations of their opponents, doesn't become obsolete as quickly as specific technical specifications do. His last posting before retirement was to the Amt für Militärkunde, the Department of Military Studies, from October of 1969 to September of 1970. He spent his final year of service in institutional military history. A man who had systematically refused to produce personal documentation throughout his operational career was, in the closing chapter of that career, employed to document military affairs institutionally. The irony is genuinely thick. He retired on the 30th of September, 1970, at the rank of Konteradmiral. He was 58 years old. The Bundesmarine and NATO received 15 years of service from the man who had nearly severed Britain's Atlantic supply line. His former enemies commanded the alliance alongside him. The binoculars were back where they belonged. What the West German military's integration of Kriegsmarine officers required, as a practical institutional matter, was a form of selective memory that was applied systematically rather than accidentally. The professional competence of the former officers was transferable and needed. The ideological and political context in which that competence had been exercised was not discussed, or was discussed in carefully managed terms that allowed for the apolitical professional framing that the founding generation of the Bundesmarine required in order to function. Kretschmer's record fit this framework better than most, in the sense that the documented evidence of his political opinions, primarily the NID interrogation report, which had noted his views were less extremely Nazi than had been assumed, was consistent with the narrative of a professional naval officer who had served the state rather than the ideology. What the framework didn't accommodate, and what I think requires honest acknowledgement, is the Grisdale Hall tribunals and the death of Oberleutnant Berndt, episodes that existed in the official record, but that weren't surfaced in the rehabilitation process in any systematic way. He had served, by the time of his retirement in September of 1970, in 3 separate German navies: the Reichsmarine of the Weimar Republic, the Kriegsmarine of the Third Reich, and the Bundesmarine of the Federal Republic of Germany. His career had run from 1930 to 1945, and then, after an 8-year gap, from 1955 to 1970. He had been on the losing side of a world war and the founding side of a Cold War alliance. He had been captured, held for nearly 7 years, promoted twice in captivity, and returned to service in the ruins of the country he'd represented. The binoculars that had travelled from a sinking U-boat in the North Atlantic to a British destroyer captain's home and back again were, by 1970, simply an object in a house in Bavaria, which is exactly the kind of ending that history produces when it isn't being arranged for dramatic effect. The first substantial biography of Otto Kretschmer was published in 1955 by a journalist named Terence Robertson. It was called The Golden Horseshoe, taking its title from the symbol painted on U-99's conning tower, and it was the first book-length account of his operational career to reach a general audience. Robertson had access to Kretschmer personally during the research process, which gave the book an authority that no subsequent treatment without direct access could replicate. It also gave Kretschmer influence over a document that was, in practice, the primary lens through which public understanding of his career would form for the next 3 decades. He didn't write his own memoir. He helped Robertson write a book that served some of the same functions a memoir would have served, while maintaining the distance of the third person and the authority of a named author who wasn't him. The control was quieter than a memoir, and probably more durable for it. Robertson's book is simultaneously a primary source. It reflects what Kretschmer chose to say in the early 1950s about events in the early 1940s, and a document that requires the same careful source analysis as anything else in this archive. Donald McIntyre's memoir, published in 1956 as U-Boat Killer, appeared within a year of Robertson's biography and covered some of the same events from the opposite perspective. Where Robertson and McIntyre overlap, principally around the sinking of U-99 on the night of the 16th to 17th of March, 1941, they're broadly consistent on the factual sequence and divergent on tone and some specific descriptive details. Both books appeared roughly 15 years after the events they describe, which means both carry the distortions that memoir reconstruction over that interval tends to produce. The remembered drama of a significant experience tends to accumulate, in retrospect, the emotional weight that was present at the time, filling in details that were probably experienced but not recorded contemporaneously. This doesn't make either book dishonest. It makes them exactly what they are: accounts written by intelligent, observant participants long after the event, shaped by memory, perspective, and the specific purposes for which each author was writing. The second major biographical wave didn't arrive until Larry Patterson's Otto Kretschmer, The Life of Germany's Highest-Scoring U-Boat Commander, published in 2018, more than 60 years after Robertson. Patterson's approach is archivally grounded in a way that Robertson's couldn't have been, drawing on the full corpus of German naval records that had become accessible in the intervening decades, cross-referenced against British Admiralty records, Norwegian and Danish maritime databases, and the secondary scholarship that had accumulated around the Battle of the Atlantic since the 1950s. It's the most thoroughly sourced account of Kretschmer's career that exists, and it handles the complexity of the operational record with more rigor than most popular audience biography manages. Its limitations are genuine but understandable. The Norwegian and Danish sources, which are where the records of neutral vessel sinkings in the North Sea live, the Verild, the Fredville, the Scotia, appear in Patterson's account primarily through the mediation of Geir Haar's scholarship rather than through primary Norwegian research. The German naval records are the load-bearing structure of the book. The perspective of the people on the receiving end of what U-23 and U-99 did is present, but not equally weighted. The chivalrous ace framework that has persisted across nearly every popular treatment of Kretschmer's career didn't originate with any single author. It formed through an accretion of choices, editorial emphases, anecdotal selections, the repeated inclusion of certain episodes, and the quiet omission of others, across 6 decades of biographical writing and documentary production. The rescue of the survivor in the raft appears in Robertson, appears in Patterson, appears in every documentary that covers Kretschmer's career. The death of Burnt at Grisdale Hall appears in Patterson's footnotes and in specialized accounts of the prisoner of war system, and essentially nowhere in the popular treatments. The 33 dead on the Tibetan appear in the casualty statistics, but not in the narrative thread that follows Kretschmer from the North Sea to the Atlantic. This isn't conspiracy. It's the natural behavior of biographical narrative, which tends toward the human complexity that makes its subject compelling, rather than the human cost that makes him uncomfortable. The British cultural tradition of honouring the gallant foe has something to do with this. McIntyre's memoir is built around a specific British officer's code that found genuine respect for a capable enemy, not incompatible with having defeated him. The chivalric framing was, in some ways, a compliment that the captor paid to the captured. It said, in effect, that the person who had been defeated was worthy of defeat by a worthy opponent. This served British morale purposes as well as German ones. A Britain that had struggled enormously to suppress the U-boat campaign could take more satisfaction from having finally caught a formidable adversary than from having caught merely a dangerous one. The Kretschmer mythology was therefore partly a British construction as well as a German one, and it served both sides' post-war purposes in different but compatible ways. The Centre for International Maritime Security published an interview with Patterson in 2018 on the occasion of the book's release, which is the only extended public discussion of sources and methodology around the Kretschmer record I've been able to find. Patterson acknowledges the competing tonnage figures in that discussion and notes that a full reconciliation against Lloyd's Register would require archival work that hasn't been done in a systematic published form. He's right about this, and the absence of that reconciliation work is one of the genuine gaps in the Kretschmer literature. The 4th and 5th significant figures of the tonnage record, the digits that determine whether the total is 272,000 or 274,000 gross register tons, and whether the ship count is 46 or 47, remain unresolved in the scholarly literature in a way that the record's prominence in the history of the Battle of the Atlantic arguably doesn't warrant. The broader historiographical question that Kretschmer's case raises, about how to write the careers of highly effective military officers who served criminal regimes, isn't specific to this story, but it's sharply illustrated by it. The West German institutional framework that enabled his reintegration into the Bundesmarine required a separation between professional competence and political institutional context that historians working after the Cold War have found progressively harder to sustain. The generation of scholars who've worked on Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine history since the 1990s, partly in response to the crimes of the Wehrmacht exhibition and its aftermath, have increasingly argued that apolitical professional was never an accurate description of how the German armed forces actually functioned under the Third Reich, and that the retroactive separation of the military from the regime it served was an institutional convenience rather than a historical reality. This argument doesn't resolve the specific question of where Kretschmer personally sat on the spectrum of ideological commitment versus professional instrumentalism. The NID report's observation that his views were less extremely Nazi than had been assumed is evidence, not a verdict. But it does suggest that the frame that protected his post-war rehabilitation shouldn't be accepted uncritically as the analytical frame for his historical evaluation. The specific archival problem of Kretschmer as a historical subject, the near total absence of personal documentation, is something that the biographical literature has mostly treated as a colourful characteristic rather than a methodological challenge. The Silent Otto nickname, applied initially to his tactical radio discipline, has migrated in the popular accounts into a general characterization of his personality, and from there into something approaching an explanation for the documentary silence. He was private by nature, the story goes, and so he left no memoir, no letters, no reflective writing. This is probably true as a description of his character, but it also means that the entire edifice of biographical interpretation is built on a foundation where the subject's own voice is almost entirely absent. We have what he told Robertson in the early 1950s. We have what the NID interrogators recorded in April of 1941. We have the war diary entries, which are navigational and operational rather than personal. Everything else, his inner life throughout his entire career, his response to the war, his understanding of what he was part of, has to be inferred from documents written by others about a man who declined to write about himself. The most honest sentence in the Kretschmer bibliography may be Larry Patterson's admission in the 2018 biography that Kretschmer's thoughts on Hitler and the subsequent conference are not known. It appears in the chapter covering Kretschmer's November 1940 visit to Berlin, when he sat at lunch with Hitler and the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov. He was the most successful submarine commander in the German service. He was in the room with the leadership of the regime he served, and he left not a single word about what that experience was like, or what he made of it. Patterson found the same silence I found. The archive has the invitation, the setting, the participants. It doesn't have the man. On the 5th of August, 1998, Otto Kretschmer died in a hospital in Straubing, Bavaria, from head injuries sustained in a fall. He had been on a holiday cruise along the Danube with his wife Erika, travelling from Regensburg to Budapest to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. He attempted to climb a very steep set of steps. The German press reports from the time described them as nearly vertical, and fell. He was 86 years old. The cause of death, recorded in the hospital register, was head trauma. His body was cremated. A funeral ceremony was held at Hinter, a small farming village in Lower Saxony near the Dutch border, nowhere near the Atlantic and nowhere near the Baltic. A flat, quiet piece of the North German plain that had no particular connection to the sea. His ashes were then taken to the ocean and scattered. Which ocean, by which route, in whose hands, is not recorded in any source I have found. He disappeared into water without a marker. The manner of his death, a fall on a holiday staircase, at 86, on his 50th wedding anniversary, is so devoid of dramatic architecture that it almost functions as a comment on the mythology that surrounded him. He had survived depth charges that drove U-99 below its rated crush depth in March of 1941. He had survived nearly 7 years of captivity in Britain and Canada. He had survived the end of a world war and the dissolution of the country he'd served, and the rebuilding of a different country in its place. He had served in 3 navies across 40 years, and he died climbing stairs on a pleasure boat on the Danube. History doesn't arrange its endings for emotional effect. This is what most endings actually look like. The 50th wedding anniversary places the marriage in 1948, the year after his release from captivity. He had returned from Bowmanville in December of 1947 and married Erika Muhlenbruch within the following year. The personal record of that transition, from Camp 30 in Ontario to a life in post-war Germany, from prisoner to husband to Bundesmarine officer to NATO admiral, is as sparsely documented as everything else about him. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't give extended interviews about his post-war life. The personal chapter was kept as private as everything else had been, which is consistent and also frustrating. He spent 50 years with Otto Kretschmer, and the record of those 50 years is a near total blank. By the time of his death in August of 1998, Kretschmer had outlived all three of the other commanders whose careers most closely intersected with his. Günther Prien had died on the 7th of March, 1941, almost certainly in a depth charge attack on U-47 in the North Atlantic. No survivors, no confirmed wreck, a death that was managed by German propaganda for weeks before being acknowledged. Joachim Schepke had died on the bridge of U-100 on the same night Kretschmer was captured, killed when HMS Vanoc rammed his surface submarine. Heinrich Bleichrodt, who had sailed with Kretschmer against multiple convoys in the autumn of 1940, survived the war and died in 1977. Karl Dönitz, who had commanded the entire U-boat arm and eventually succeeded Hitler as head of the German state in the war's final days, survived to write his memoirs, stand trial at Nuremberg, serve a 10-year prison sentence, and die in 1980. Kretschmer outlasted all of them and left, of them all, the smallest written record. The tonnage record has stood since March of 1941, 85 years. No submarine commander of any nationality in any subsequent conflict has come close to the confirmed total. Between 272,000 and 274,000 gross register tons across 46 or 47 ships in 18 months of combat command. The record is safe not because the world has run out of submarines or submarine commanders, but because the conditions that made it achievable, the temporary convergence of operational freedom, defensive vacuum, and tactical innovation in a specific historical window, will not recur. The happy time lasted approximately 18 months. It closed because technology, doctrine, production capacity, and code breaking caught up with it simultaneously. The window that allowed Kretschmer to achieve what he achieved was not manufactured by his own genius alone. It was produced by a specific historical moment. He was extraordinary within it. He couldn't have extended it. When I try to write a summary judgment of Otto Kretschmer, when I sit with the full corpus of what the archive contains and ask what it finally amounts to, I find that the archive resists the request. It doesn't close neatly. It holds, simultaneously, the NID interrogation report's portrait of a quiet, weary, politically moderate man who looked like a student, the War Diary's clinical record of 33 dead on the Tibetan and 15 dead on the Verild, and no entries for what he made of either. The Knight's Cross with swords in a Red Cross parcel on its way to a prison camp in Cumbria, the binoculars travelling from a sinking submarine to a British destroyer captain's mantelpiece and back again over 14 years. Burnt climbing over a wire in Cumbria and not coming back. These things don't reduce to a single verdict. They coexist in the record, and the record is what we have. What I can say with reasonable confidence, after working through this archive in its full complexity, is that the most durable popular image of Kretschmer, the chivalrous, apolitical professional who fought with distinction and treated his enemies with respect, is not false, but it is partial. It was partly his own construction, communicated through Robertson's authorized biography. It was partly a British construction, serving the specific cultural purposes of honoring a worthy adversary. It was partly an institutional construction, serving the West German military's need for a founding generation of officers whose wartime service could be framed as professional rather than ideological. Each of these constructions drew on genuine elements of the record. None of them drew on the full record. The full record includes burnt. It includes the Tibetan. It includes a man who told his captors he'd stopped finding satisfaction in what he was doing while he was still doing it, and then spent 18 more months doing it. He chose, across his entire life, to leave as little of himself in writing as he possibly could. The war diary is navigational. The Robertson collaboration produced someone else's book. The post-war interviews were minimal. The memoir was never written. He made himself into a document by refusing to write one, which means the documents that survive about him were written by others, from their own positions, with their own purposes, and they constitute the record whether he wanted them to or not. The NID interrogation report exists because British intelligence officers did their jobs in April of 1941. The Board of Trade Inquiry reports exist because maritime law requires them. The Admiralty Convoy reports exist because the battle was being documented in real time. The war diary exists because the Kriegsmarine required it. None of these documents was written for posterity's benefit. They were written for immediate operational or administrative purposes, and they became the archive by default because everything else was silence. His ashes are somewhere in the sea. The record doesn't say which sea or where or when exactly the scattering occurred. The ceremony at Hinter preceded it. After that, the archive runs out entirely. Not with a document that says the story ends here, but simply with the last entry, which is a hospital death register in Straubing, dated the 5th of August, 1998, recording head trauma as the cause of death. After that entry, nothing. The Atlantic doesn't know what it holds. It held his operational career for 18 months. It held the ships he sank for the duration. It held, presumably, whatever portion of him was carried out to it from a flat farming village in Lower Saxony, sometime after the funeral ceremony at Hinter in August of 1998. The water received him the way water receives everything, without comment, without record, without the slightest acknowledgement of the difference between what was significant and what was not. The tonnage record stands. The archive is incomplete. The man, characteristically, left almost no instructions for how to read either.